Section 38 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joseph Tabler. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 7, by various authors. Section 38. Caius Julius Cæsar, 100 BC to 44 BC, by J.H. Westcott. Truly a wonderful man was Caius Julius Cæsar, says Captain Miles Standish. Truly wonderful he was on each of his many sides, as soldier, statesman, orator, and author, all of the first rank, and a respectable critic, man of science, and poet besides. As a writer of Latin prose, and as an orator, he was second to Cicero alone in the age that is called the Ciceronian, and no third is to be named with these two. Yet among his contemporaries, his literary power was an insignificant title to fame compared with his overwhelming military and political genius. Here he stood alone, unrivaled, the most successful conqueror and civilizer of all history, the founder of the most majestic political fabric the world has ever seen. There have been other generals, statesmen, authors as great as Cæsar, but the extraordinary combination of powers in this one man goes very far toward making good the claim that he was the most remarkable man in history. He was born in 100 BC, a member of the great Julian gens, which claimed descent from Aeneas and Venus, the glories of which are celebrated in Virgil's immortal epic. Thus the future leader of the turbulent democracy, and the future despot who was to humble the nobles of Rome, was by birth an aristocrat of bluest blood. His life might easily have come to an untimely end in the days of Sulla's bloody ascendancy, for he was connected by marriage with Marius and Cinna. Sulla was persuaded to spare him, but clearly saw even then that in Cæsar there were many Mariuses. All young Romans of rank were expected to go through a term of at least nominal military service. Cæsar's apprenticeship was in Asia Minor in 80 BC. He distinguished himself at the storming of Mytilene, and afterwards served in Cilicia. He began his political and oratorical career by the prosecution of Cornelius Dolabella, one of the nobility, on a charge of extortion. About 75 BC, he was continuing his studies at Rhodes, then a famous school of eloquence. Obtaining the quaestorship in 67 BC, he was assigned to duty in the province of Further Spain. 2 years later, he became aedile. At the age of 37, he was elected Pontifex Maximus over two powerful competitors. Entirely without religious belief, as far as we can judge, he recognized the importance of this portion of the civil order, and mastered the intricate lore of the established ceremonial. In this office, which he held for life, he busied himself with a digest of the auspices, and wrote an essay on divination. After filling the praetorship in 62 BC, he obtained a propraetor, the governorship of his old province of Further Spain, which he was destined to visit twice in later years as conqueror in civil war. His military success at this time against the native tribes was such as to entitle him to the honor of a triumph. This he was obliged to forego in order to stand at once for the consulship, which office he held for the year 59 BC. He had previously entered into a private agreement with Pompey and Crassus, known as the First Triumvirate. Cæsar had always presented himself as the friend of the people. Pompey was the most famous man of the time, covered with military laurels, and regarded, though not with perfect confidence, as the champion of the senatorial party. Crassus, a man of ordinary ability, was valuable to the other two on account of his enormous wealth. these three men agreed to unite their interests and their influence. In accordance with this arrangement, Cæsar obtained the consulship and then the command for 5 years, afterward extended to 10, of the provinces of Gaul and Illyricum. It was while proconsul of Gaul in the years 58 to 50 B.C. that he subjugated and organized all Gaul, which was far greater in extent than the country which is now France, increased his own political and material resources, and above all formed an army the most highly trained and efficient the world had yet seen, entirely faithful to himself, by means of which he was able in the years 49 to 46 B.C. to defeat all his political antagonists and to gain absolute power over the state. He held the consulship again in 48 and 46 B.C., and was consul without a colleague in 45 and 44 B.C., as well as dictator with authority to remodel the constitution. While his far-reaching plans of organization and improvement were incomplete, and when he was about to start upon a war against the Parthians on the eastern frontier of the empire, he was murdered March 15, 44 B.C., by a band of conspirators headed by Brutus and Cassius. For purposes of a literary judgment of Cæsar, we have of his own works, in complete or nearly complete form, his military memoirs only. His specifically literary works have all perished. A few sentences from his speeches, a few of his letters, a few wise or witty sayings, an anecdote or two scattered about in the pages of other authors, and 6 lines of hexameter verse, containing a critical estimate of the dramatist Terence, are all that remain as specimens of what is probably forever lost to us. An enumeration of his works, so far as their titles are known, is the best evidence of his versatility. A bit of criticism here and there shows the estimation in which Cæsar the writer and orator was held by his countrymen and contemporaries. Besides the military memoirs and the works spoken of above in connection with his pontificate, we may mention as of a semi-official character his astronomical treatise on the stars, De Astris, published in connection with his reform of the calendar when dictator shortly before the end of his life. Cicero alludes to a collection of witty sayings, apophthegms, made by Cæsar with evident satisfaction at the latter's ability to distinguish the real and the false Ciceronian bon mots. Like most Roman gentlemen, Cæsar wrote in youth several poems, of which Tacitus grimly says that they were not better than Cicero's. This list includes a tragedy, Oedipus, Laudus Herculis, the praises of Hercules, and a metrical account of a journey into Spain, Iter. A grammatical treatise in 2 books, De Analogia, dedicated to Cicero, to the latter's immense gratification, was written on one of the numerous swift journeys from Italy to headquarters in Gaul. Passages from it are quoted by several subsequent writers, and an anecdote preserved by Aulus Gellius in his Noctes Attica 1:10-4, wherein a young man is warned by Cæsar to avoid unusual and far-fetched language like a rock, is supposed to be very characteristic of his general attitude in matters of literary taste. The Anticatones were a couple of political pamphlets ridiculing Cato, the idol of the Republicans. This was small business for Cæsar, but Cato had taken rather a mean advantage by his dramatic suicide at Utica, and deprived Cæsar of the pleasure of pardoning him. Of Cæsar's orations we have none but the most insignificant fragments. Our judgment of them must be based on the testimony of ancient critics. Quintilian speaks in the same paragraph, Quintilian 10:1-114, of the wonderful elegance of his language, and of the force which made it seem that he spoke with the same spirit with which he fought. Cicero's phrase magnifica et generosa Cicero Brutus 261, and Fronto's Facultas Descendi Imperatoria, Fronto EP page 123, indicate some kind of severe magnificence. Collections of his letters were extant in the 2nd century, but nothing now remains except a few brief notes to Cicero, copied by the latter in his correspondence with Atticus. This loss is perhaps the one most to be regretted. Letters reveal their author's personality better than more formal species of composition, and Cæsar was almost the last real letter writer, the last who used in its perfection the polished, cultivated conversational language, the Sermo Urbanus. But after all, we possess the most important of his writings, the commentaries on the Gallic and civil wars. The first may be considered as a formal report to the Senate and the public on the conduct of his Gallic campaigns, the latter as primarily intended for a defense of his constitutional position in the Civil War. They are memoirs, halfway between private notes and formal history. Cicero says that while their author desired to give others the material out of which to create a history, he may perhaps have done a kindness to conceited writers who wish to trick them out with meretricious graces, to crimp with curling irons, but he has deterred all men of sound taste from ever touching them. For in history a pure and brilliant conciseness of style is the highest attainable beauty. They are worthy of all praise, for they are simple, straightforward, and elegant, with all rhetorical ornament stripped from them as a garment is stripped. Cicero Brutus 262. The 7 books of the Gallic War are each the account of a year's campaigning. They were written apparently in winter quarters. When Cæsar entered on the administration of his province, it was threatened with invasion. The Romans had never lost their dread of the northern barbarians, nor forgotten the capture of Rome 3 centuries before. Only a generation back, Marius had become the national hero by destroying the invading hordes of Cimbri and Teutonis. Cæsar purposed to make the barbarians tremble at the Roman name. This first book of the commentaries tells how he raised an army in haste, with which he outmarched, outmaneuvered, and defeated the Helvetian nation. This people, urged by pressure behind and encouragement in front, had determined to leave its old home in the Alpine valleys and to settle in the fairer regions of southeastern France. Surprised and dismayed by Cæsar's terrific reception of their supposed invincible host, they had to choose between utter destruction and a tame return with sadly diminished numbers to their old abodes. Nor was this all the work of the first year. Ariovistus, a German king, also invited by a Gallic tribe, and relying on the terror of his nation's name, came to establish himself and his people on the Gallic side of the Rhine. He too was astonished at the tone with which Cæsar ordered him to depart, but soon found himself forced to return far more quickly than he had come. Having thus vindicated the Roman claim to the frontiers of Gaul against other invaders, the proconsul devoted his second summer to the subjugation of the Belgae, the most warlike and the most remote of the Gauls. The second book tells how this was accomplished. There was one moment when the conqueror's career came near ending prematurely. One of the Belgian tribes, the valiant Nervii, surprised and nearly defeated the Roman army. But steady discipline and the dauntless courage of the commander, never so great as in moments of mortal peril, saved the day, and the Nervii are immortalized as the people who nearly destroyed Cæsar. These unprecedented successes all round the eastern and northern frontiers thoroughly established Roman prestige and strengthened Rome's supremacy over the central Gauls, who were already her allies, at least in name, but much yet remained to do. The work was but fairly begun. The third book tells of the conquest of the western tribes. The most interesting episode is the creation of a fleet and the naval victory over the Veneti on the faraway coast of Brittany. In the 4th year, Cæsar crossed the Rhine after building a wonderful wooden bridge in 10 days, carried fire and sword among the Germans on the further bank, and returned to his side of the river, destroying the bridge behind him. Modern schoolboys wish he had never built it. Later in the season, he made an expedition into Britain. This was followed in the 5th year by an invasion of the island in greater force. To the people of our race, this portion of the commentaries is especially interesting. The southern part of the country was overrun. The Thames was crossed some miles above London, and several victories were gained, but no organized conquest was attempted. That remained for the age of Claudius and later emperors. During the ensuing winter, on account of the scarcity of provisions, the Roman troops had to be quartered in separate detachments at long distances. One of these was treacherously destroyed by the Gauls, and the others were saved only by the extraordinary quickness with which Cæsar marched to their relief on hearing of their imminent danger. The chief part in this rising had been taken by the Eburones, led by their king Ambiorix. A large part of the 6th book is occupied with the recital of Cæsar's vengeance upon these people and their abettors, and with the vain pursuit of Ambiorix. The remainder contains an elaborate contrast of the manners and customs of the Gauls and the Germans, which forms an important source for the history of the primitive institutions of these nations. The 7th book is the thrilling tale of the formidable rising of all the Gauls against their conquerors, under the leadership of Vercingetorix, an Arvernian chief. This man was a real hero, brave, patriotic, resourceful, perhaps the only worthy antagonist that Cæsar ever met. This war strained to the utmost Cæsar's abilities and the disciplined valor of his legions. The Gauls nearly succeeded in undoing all the work of 6 years, in destroying the Roman army and in throwing off the Roman yoke. In this campaign, more conspicuously than ever before, Cæsar's success was due to the unexampled rapidity of his movements. So perfect had become the training of his troops and their confidence in his ability to win under all circumstances, that after a campaign of incredible exertions they triumphed over the countless hosts of their gallant foes, and in the next 2 years the last embers of Gaulish independence were finally stamped out. In all his later years, Cæsar never had anything to fear from Gaul. As we read the story of Avaricum, of Gergovia, of Alesia, our sympathy goes out to the brave barbarians who were fighting for liberty. But we have to remember that though the cause of freedom failed, the cause of civilization triumphed. The 8th book, containing the account of the next 2 years, 51 and 50 B.C., were written by one of Cæsar's officers, Aulus Hirtius. The first book of the Civil War begins with the year 49 B.C., where the struggle between Cæsar and the senatorial party opens with his crossing of the Rubicon, attended by the advanced guard of his legions. Pompey proved a broken reed to those who leaned upon him, and Cæsar's conquest of the Italian peninsula was little else than a triumphal progress through the country. The enemy retired to the eastern shore of the Adriatic to muster the forces of the East on the side of the aristocracy, leaving Cæsar in possession of the capital and of the machinery of government. The latter part of the book contains the account of the campaign against Pompey's lieutenants in Spain, which was won almost without bloodshed, by masterly strategy, and which ended with the complete possession of the peninsula. The second book describes the capture of Marseilles after a long siege, and the tragic defeat and death of Curio, a brave but rash young officer sent by Cæsar to secure the African province. In the third book, 48 B.C., we have the story of the campaign against Pompey. First, the audacious blockade for months of Pompey's greatly superior forces near Dyrrhachium on the Illyrian coast, and when that failed, of the long march into Thessaly, where Pompey was at last forced into battle against his judgment by his own officers on the fatal plains of Pharsalia, of the annihilation of the senatorial army, of Pompey's flight to Egypt, of his treacherous murder there, of Cæsar's pursuit. The books on the Alexandrian, the African, and the Spanish wars, which continue the narrative down to Cæsar's final victory at Munda in southern Spain, are by other and inferior hands. The question of their authorship has been the subject of much controversy and conjecture. Under this modest title of Commentaries, in the guise of a simple narrative of events, Cæsar puts forth at once an inimitable history and a masterly apology. The author speaks of himself in the third person, tells of the circumstances of each situation in a quiet, moderate way, which carries with it the conviction on the reader's part of his entire truthfulness, accuracy, and candor. We are persuaded that the Cæsar about whom he tells could not have acted otherwise than he did. In short, he exercises the same spell over our minds that he cast over the hearts of men 20 centuries ago. There is nothing that so fascinates and enchains the imagination of men as power in another man. This man could captivate a woman by his sweetness, or tame an angry mob of soldiers with a word, could mold the passions of a corrupt democracy, or exterminate a nation in a day, could organize an empire or polish an epigram. His strength was terrible, but all this immense power was marvelously balanced and under perfect control. Nothing was too small for his delicate tact. Nothing he did was so difficult but we feel he could have done more. Usually his means seemed inadequate to his ends, but it was Cæsar who used them. The commentaries show us this man at his work. They show him as an organizer of armies and alliances, a wily diplomatist, an intrepid soldier, an efficient administrator, a strategist of inspired audacity, a tactician of endless resources, an engineer of infinite inventiveness, an unerring judge of men. But he never boasts, except in speeches to hearten discouraged troops. He does not vilify or underrate his enemies. His soldiers trusted him implicitly. There was no limit to their zeal. They found in him a generous appreciation of their deeds. Many a soldier and centurion has received immortality at his hands as the guerdon of valor. He describes a victory of Labienus with as much satisfaction as if it had been his own, and praises another lieutenant for his prudent self-restraint when tempted by a prospect of success. And he tells with hearty admiration of the devoted Gauls who sacrificed their lives one after another in a post of danger at Avaricum. Even in the civil war no officers deserted him except Labienus and 2 Gaulish chiefs. It was difficult to deceive him. His analysis of other men's motives is as merciless as it is passionless. He makes us disapprove the course of his antagonists with the same moderate but convincing statement with which he recommends his own. Few men can have had as few illusions as he. One would scarcely care to possess such an insight into the hearts of others. He seems to feel little warmth of indignation and never indulges in invective. But woe to those who stood in the way of the accomplishment of his objects. Dreadful was the punishment of those who revolted after making peace. Still, even his vengeance seems dictated by policy rather than by passion. He is charged with awful cruelty because he slew 1,000,000 men and sold another 1,000,000 into slavery. But he did not enjoy human suffering. These were simply necessary incidents in the execution of his plans. It is hard to see how European civilization could have proceeded without the conquest of Gaul, and it is surely better to make a conquest complete, rapid, overpowering, that the work may have to be done but once. It is hard not to judge men by the standards of our own age. The ancients rarely felt an international humanity, and in his own time Cæsar's clemency was proverbial. As he was always careful not to waste in useless fighting the lives of his soldiers, he was always true to his precept, "Spare the citizens." The way in which he repeatedly forgave his enemies when they were in his power was an example to many a Christian conqueror. The best of his antagonists showed themselves bloodthirsty in word or act, and most of them, not excepting Cicero, were basely ungrateful for his forbearance. His treatment of Cicero was certainly most handsome. Our knowledge of it is derived mainly from Cicero's letters. Perhaps this magnanimity was dashed with a tinge of kindly contempt for his fellow citizens, but whatever its motives, it was certainly wise and benign at the beginning of the new era he was inaugurating. He was no vulgar destroyer, and did not desire to ruin in order to rule. He is charged with ambition, the sin by which the angels fell. It is not for us to fathom the depths of his mighty mind. Let us admit the charge, but it was not an ignoble ambition. Let us say that he was so ambitious that he laid the foundations of the Roman Empire and of modern France, that his services to civilization and his plans for humanity were so broad that patriots were driven to murder him. Some of Cæsar's eulogists have claimed for him a moral greatness corresponding to his transcendent mental power. This is mistaken zeal. He may stand as the supreme representative of the race in the way of practical executive intellect. It is poor praise to put him into another order of men with Plato or with Paul. Their greatness was of another kind. We cannot speak of degrees. He is the exponent of creative force in political history, not of speculative or ethical power. Moreover, with all his originality of conception and power of execution, Cæsar lacked that kind of imagination which makes the true poet the real creative artist in literature. Thus we observe the entire absence of the pictorial element in his writings. There is no trace of his ever being affected by the spectacular incidents of warfare, nor by the grandeur of the natural scenes through which he passed. The reason may be that his intellect was absorbed in the contemplation of men and motives, of means and ends. We cannot conceive of his ever having been carried out of himself by the rapture of inspiration. Such clearness of mental perception is naturally accompanied by a certain coolness of temperament. A man of superlative greatness must live more or less alone among his fellows. With his immense grasp of the relations of things in the world, Cæsar cannot have failed to regard men to some extent as the counters in a great game, himself the player. So he used men, finding them instruments, efficient and zealous often, of his far-reaching plans. He was just in rewarding their services, more than just. He was generous and kind, but he did not have real associates, real friends. Therefore it is not surprising that he met with so little gratitude. Even his diction shows this independence, this isolation. It would be difficult to find an author of any nation in a cultivated age so free from the influence of the language of his predecessors. Cæsar was unique among the great Roman writers in having been born at the capital. Appropriately, he is the incarnation of the specifically Roman spirit in literature, as Cicero was the embodiment of the Italian, the Hellenic, the cosmopolitan spirit. Toward the close of Cæsar's career there are some signs of weariness observable, a certain loss of serenity, a suspicion of vanity, a dimming of his penetrating vision into the men about him. The only wonder is that mind and body had not succumbed long before to the prodigious strain put upon them. Perhaps it is well that he died when he did, hardly past his prime, so he went to his setting like the other weary Titan, leaving behind him a brightness which lasted all through the night of the Dark Ages. Cæsar died, but the imperial idea of which he was the first embodiment has proved the central force of European political history even down to our time. Such is the man who speaks to us from his pages still. He was a man who did things rather than a man who said things. Yet who could speak so well? His mastery of language was perfect, but in the same way as his mastery of other instruments. Style with him was a means rather than an end. He had the training which others of his kind enjoyed. Every Roman noble had to learn oratory, but Cæsar wrote and spoke with a faultless taste and a distinction that no training could impart. So we find in his style a beauty which does not depend upon ornament, but upon perfect proportion, a diction plain and severe almost to baldness, absolute temperateness of expression. The descriptions are spirited, but never made so by strained rhetoric. The speeches are brief, manly, businesslike, the arguments calm and convincing, always and everywhere the language of a strong man, well inside the limits of his power. The chief ancient authorities for the life of Cæsar, besides his own works, are Suetonius in Latin, Plutarch and Appian in Greek. Among modern works of which he is made the subject may be mentioned Jules Cæsar by Napoleon III, Paris, 1865, continued by Colonel Stoffel with an atlas, Cæsar, a sketch by J. Froude, London, 1886, Cæsar by A. Trollope, London, 1870, Cæsar by T. A. Dodge, USA, Boston, 1893. J. H. Westcott. End of section 38.
Section 39 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 7, by various authors. Section 39. The Defeat of Ariovistus and the Germans, from the Gallic Wars, by Caius Julius Cæsar. When he had proceeded 3 days' journey, word was brought to him that Ariovistus was hastening with all his forces to seize on Vesontio, which is the largest town of the Sequani, and had advanced 3 days' journey from his territories. Cæsar thought that he ought to take the greatest precautions lest this should happen, for there was in that town a most ample supply of everything which was serviceable for war, and so fortified was it by the nature of the ground as to afford a great facility for protracting the war, inasmuch as the river Doubs almost surrounds the whole town, as though it were traced round with a pair of compasses. A mountain of great height shuts in the remaining space, which is not more than 600 feet, where the river leaves a gap in such a manner that the roots of that mountain extend to the river's bank on either side. A wall thrown around it makes a citadel of this mountain, and connects it with the town. Hither Cæsar hastens by forced marches by night and day, and, after having seized the town, stations a garrison there. Whilst he is tarrying a few days at Vesontio, on account of corn and provisions, from the inquiries of our men and the reports of the Gauls and traders, who asserted that the Germans were men of huge stature, of incredible valour and practice in arms, that ofttimes they, on encountering them, could not bear even their countenance and the fierceness of their eyes. So great a panic on the sudden seized the whole army, so as to discompose the minds and spirits of all in no slight degree. This first arose from the tribunes of the soldiers, the prefects, and the rest, who, having followed Cæsar from the city, Rome, from motives of friendship, had no great experience in military affairs, and alleging, some of them one reason, some another, which they said made it necessary for them to depart, they requested that by his consent they might be allowed to withdraw. Some, influenced by shame, stayed behind in order that they might avoid the suspicion of cowardice. These could neither compose their countenance, nor even sometimes check their tears, but hidden in their tents, either bewailed their fate, or deplored with their comrades the general danger. Wills were sealed universally throughout the whole camp. By the expressions and cowardice of these men, even those who possessed great experience in the camp, both soldiers and centurions, and those, the decurions, who were in command of the cavalry, were gradually disconcerted. Such of them as wished to be considered less alarmed said that they did not dread the enemy, but feared the narrowness of the roads and the vastness of the forest which lay between them and Ariovistus, or else that the supplies could not be brought up readily enough. Some even declared to Cæsar that when he gave orders for the camp to be moved and the troops to advance, the soldiers would not be obedient to the command, nor advance, in consequence of their fear. When Cæsar observed these things, having called a council, and summoned to it the centurions of all the companies, he severely reprimanded them, particularly for supposing that it belonged to them to inquire or conjecture either in what direction they were marching, or with what object. That Ariovistus, during his (Cæsar's) consulship, had most anxiously sought after the friendship of the Roman people. Why should any one judge that he would so rashly depart from his duty? He, for his part, was persuaded that when his demands were known, and the fairness of the terms considered, he would reject neither his nor the Roman people's favour. But even if, driven on by rage and madness, he should make war upon them, what, after all, were they afraid of? Or why should they despair either of their own valour or of his zeal? Of that enemy a trial had been made within our father's recollection, when on the defeat of the Cimbrian Teutones by Caius Marius, the army was regarded as having deserved no less praise than their commander himself. It had been made lately, too, in Italy, during the rebellion of the slaves, whom, however, the experience and training which they had received from us assisted in some respect. From which a judgment might be formed of the advantages which resolution carries with it, inasmuch as those who for some time they had groundlessly dreaded when unarmed, they had afterwards vanquished when well armed and flushed with success. In short, that these were the same men whom the Helvetii, in frequent encounters, not only in their own territories, but also in theirs, the German, have generally vanquished, and yet cannot have been a match for our army. If the unsuccessful battle and flight of the Gauls disquieted any, these, if they made inquiries, might discover that when the Gauls had been tired out by the long duration of the war, Ariovistus, after he had many months kept himself in his camp and in the marshes, and had given no opportunity for an engagement, fell suddenly upon them, by this time despairing of a battle, and scattered in all directions, and was victorious more through stratagem and cunning than valour. But though there had been room for such stratagem against savage and unskilled men, not even Ariovistus himself expected that thereby our armies could be entrapped. That those who ascribe their fear to a pretence about the deficiency of supplies and the narrowness of the roads act presumptuously, as they seemed either to distrust their general's discharge of his duty, or to dictate to him. That these things were his concern, that the Sequani, the Luci, and the Lingones were to furnish the corn, and that it was already ripe in the fields. That as to the road, they would soon be able to judge for themselves. As to its being reported that the soldiers would not be obedient to command or advance, he was not at all disturbed by that, for he knew that in the case of all those whose army had not been obedient to command, either upon some mismanagement of an affair fortune had deserted them, or that upon some crime being discovered, covetousness had been clearly proved against them. His integrity had been seen throughout his whole life, his good fortune in the war with the Helvetii, that he would therefore instantly set about what he had intended to put off till a more distant day, and would break up his camp the next night in the fourth watch, that he might ascertain as soon as possible whether a sense of honour and duty, or whether fear, had more influence upon them. But that if no one else should follow, yet he would go with only the 10th Legion, of which he had no misgivings, and that it should be his praetorian cohort. This legion Cæsar had both greatly favoured, and in it, on account of its valour, placed the greatest confidence. Upon the delivery of this speech, the minds of all were changed in a surprising manner, and the highest ardour and eagerness for prosecuting the war were engendered, and the 10th Legion was the first to return thanks to him, through their military tribunes, for his having expressed this most favourable opinion of them, and assured him that they were quite ready to prosecute the war. Then the other legions endeavoured, through their military tribunes and the centurions of the principal companies, to excuse themselves to Cæsar, saying that they had never either doubted or feared, or supposed that the determination of the conduct of the war was theirs and not their general's. Having accepted their excuse, and having had the road carefully reconnoitred by Diviciacus, because in him of all others he had the greatest faith, he found that by a circuitous route of more than 50 miles he might lead his army through open parts. He then set out in the fourth watch, as he had said he would. On the 7th day, as he did not discontinue his march, he was informed by scouts that the forces of Ariovistus were only 24 miles distant from ours. Upon being apprised of Cæsar's arrival, Ariovistus sends ambassadors to him, saying that what he had before requested as to a conference might now, as far as his permission went, take place, since he, Cæsar, had approached nearer, and he considered that he might now do it without danger. Cæsar did not reject the proposal, and began to think that he was now returning to a rational state of mind, as he voluntarily proffered that which he had previously refused to him when he requested it, and was in great hopes that, in consideration of his own, and the Roman people's great favours towards him, the issue would be that he would desist from his obstinacy upon his demands being made known. The 5th day after that was appointed as the day of the conference. Meanwhile, as ambassadors were being often sent to and fro between them, Ariovistus demanded that Cæsar should not bring any foot soldier with him to the conference, saying that he was afraid of being ensnared by him through treachery, that both should come accompanied by cavalry, that he would not come on any other condition. Cæsar, as he neither wished that the conference should, by an excuse thrown in the way, be set aside, nor durst trust his life to the cavalry of the Gauls, decided that it would be most expedient to take away from the Gallic cavalry all their horses, and thereon to mount the legionary soldiers of the 10th Legion, in which he placed the greatest confidence, in order that he might have a bodyguard as trustworthy as possible, should there be any need for action. And when this was done, one of the soldiers of the 10th Legion said, not without a touch of humour, that Cæsar did more for them than he had promised. He had promised to have the 10th Legion in place of his Praetorian cohort, but now he converted them into horse. There was a large plain, and in it a mound of earth of considerable size. This spot was at nearly an equal distance from both camps. Thither, as had been appointed, they came for the conference. Cæsar stationed the legion which he had brought with him on horseback 200 paces from this mound. The cavalry of Ariovistus also took their stand at an equal distance. Ariovistus then demanded that they should confer on horseback, and that, besides themselves, they should bring with them 10 men each to the conference. When they were come to the place, Cæsar, in the opening of his speech, detailed his own and the Senate's favours towards him, Ariovistus, in that he had been styled king, in that he had been styled friend by the Senate, in that very considerable presents had been sent him, which circumstance he informed him had both fallen to the lot of few, and had usually been bestowed in consideration of important personal services, that he, although he had neither an introduction nor a just ground for the request, had obtained these honours through the kindness and beneficence of himself, Cæsar, and the Senate. He informed him, too, how old and how just were the grounds of connection that existed between themselves, the Romans, and the Aedui, what decrees of the Senate had been passed in their favour, and how frequent and how honourable, how from time immemorial the Aedui had held the supremacy of the whole of Gaul, even, said Cæsar, before they had sought our friendship, that it was the custom of the Roman people to desire not only that its allies and friends should lose none of their property, but be advanced in influence, dignity, and honour. Who then could endure that what they had brought with them to the friendship of the Roman people should be torn from them? He then made the same demands which he had commissioned the ambassadors to make, that Ariovistus should not make war either upon the Aedui or their allies, that he should restore the hostages, that if he could not send back to their country any part of the Germans, he should at all events suffer none of them any more to cross the Rhine. Ariovistus replied briefly to the demands of Cæsar, but expatiated largely on his own virtues, that he had crossed the Rhine not of his own accord, but on being invited and sent for by the Gauls, that he had not left home and kindred without great expectations and great rewards, that he had settlements in Gaul granted by the Gauls themselves, that the hostages had been given by their own good will, that he took by right of war the tribute which conquerors are accustomed to impose on the conquered, that he had not made war upon the Gauls, but the Gauls upon him, that all the states of Gaul came to attack him and had encamped against him, that all their forces had been routed and beaten by him in a single battle, that if they chose to make a second trial, he was ready to encounter them again, but if they chose to enjoy peace, it was unfair to refuse the tribute which of their own free will they had paid up to that time, that the friendship of the Roman people ought to prove to him an ornament and a safeguard, not a detriment, and that he sought it with that expectation, But if through the Roman people the tribute was to be discontinued, and those who surrendered to be seduced from him, he would renounce the friendship of the Roman people no less heartily than he had sought it. As to his leading over a host of Germans into Gaul, that he was doing this with a view of securing himself, not of assaulting Gaul, that there was evidence of this, in that he did not come without being invited, and in that he did not make war, but merely warded it off, that he had come into Gaul before the Roman people, that never before this time did a Roman army go beyond the frontiers of the province of Gaul. What, said he, does Cæsar desire? Why come into his (Ariovistus's) domains? That this was his province of Gaul, just as that is ours. As it ought not to be pardoned in him if he were to make an attack upon our territories, so likewise that we were unjust to obstruct him in his prerogative. As for Cæsar's saying that the Aedui had been styled brethren by the Senate, he was not so uncivilized, nor so ignorant of affairs, as not to know that the Aedui, in the very last war with the Allobrages, had neither rendered assistance to the Romans, nor received any from the Roman people in the struggles which the Aedui had been maintaining with him and the Sequani. He must feel suspicious that Cæsar, though feigning friendship as a reason for his keeping an army in Gaul, was keeping it in the view of crushing him, and that unless he depart and withdraw his army from these parts, he shall regard him not as a friend, but as a foe, and that even if he should put him to death, he should do what would please many of the nobles and leading men of the Roman people. He had assurance of that from themselves through their messengers, and could purchase the favour and friendship of them all by his (Cæsar's) death. But if he would depart and resign to him the free possession of Gaul, he would recompense him with a great reward, and would bring to a close whatever wars he wished to be carried on without any trouble or risk to him. Many things were stated by Cæsar to the following effect: that he could not waive the business, and that neither his nor the Roman people's practice would suffer him to abandon most meritorious allies. Nor did he deem that Gaul belonged to Ariovistus rather than to the Roman people, that the Arverni and the Ruteni had been subdued in war by Quintus Fabius Maximus, and that the Roman people had pardoned them, and had not reduced them into a province or imposed a tribute upon them. And if the most ancient period was to be regarded, then was the sovereignty of the Roman people in Gaul most just. If the decree of the Senate was to be observed, then ought Gaul to be free, which they, the Romans, had conquered in war, and had permitted to enjoy its own laws. While these things were being transacted in the conference, it was announced to Cæsar that the cavalry of Ariovistus were approaching nearer the mound, and were riding up to our men and casting stones and weapons at them. Cæsar made an end of his speech, and betook himself to his men, and commanded them that they should by no means return a weapon upon the enemy. For though he saw that an engagement with the cavalry would be without any danger to his chosen legion, yet he did not think proper to engage, lest after the enemy were routed it might be said that they had been ensnared by him under the sanction of a conference. When it was spread abroad among the common soldiery with what haughtiness Ariovistus had behaved at the conference, and how he had ordered the Romans to quit Gaul, and how his cavalry had made an attack upon our men, and how this had broken off the conference, a much greater alacrity and eagerness for battle was infused into our army. 2 days after, Ariovistus sends ambassadors to Cæsar to state that he wished to treat with him about those things which had been begun to be treated of between them, but had not been concluded, and to beg that he would either again appoint a day for the conference, or, if he were not willing to do that he would send one of his officers as an ambassador to him. There did not appear to Cæsar any good reason for holding a conference, and the more so as the day before the Germans could not be restrained from casting weapons at our men. He thought he should not, without great danger, send to him as ambassador one of his Roman officers, and should expose him to savage men. It seemed, therefore, most proper to send to him C. Valerius Procillus, the son of C. Valerius Caburus, a young man of the highest courage and accomplishments, whose father had been presented with the freedom of the city by C. Valerius Flaccus, both on account of his fidelity and on account of his knowledge of the Gallic language, which Ariovistus, by long practice, now spoke fluently, and because, in his case, the Germans would have no motive for committing violence. and for his colleague Medius, who had shared the hospitality of Ariovistus. He commissioned them to learn what Ariovistus had to say, and to report to him. But when Ariovistus saw them before him in his camp, he cried out in the presence of his army, "Why were they come to him? Was it for the purpose of acting as spies?" He stopped them when attempting to speak, and cast them into chains. The same day he moved his camp forward, and pitched under a hill 6 miles from Cæsar's camp. The day following he led his forces past Cæsar's camp, and encamped 2 miles beyond him, with this design, that he might cut off Cæsar from the corn and provisions which might be conveyed to him from the Sequani and the Aedui. For 5 successive days from that day Cæsar drew out his forces before the camp and put them in battle order, that if Ariovistus should be willing to engage in battle, an opportunity might not be wanting to him. Ariovistus all this time kept his army in camp, but engaged daily in cavalry skirmishes. The method of battle in which the Germans had practised themselves was this. There were 6,000 horse, and as many very active and courageous foot, one of whom each of the horse selected out of the whole army for his own protection. By these men they were constantly accompanied on their engagements. To these the horse retired. These on any emergency rushed forward. If any one, upon receiving a very severe wound, had fallen from his horse, they stood round him. If it was necessary to advance further than usual, or to retreat more rapidly, so great, from practice, was their swiftness, that supported by the manes of the horses, they could keep pace with their speed. Perceiving that Ariovistus kept himself in camp, Cæsar, that he might not any longer be cut off from provisions, chose a convenient position for a camp beyond that place in which the Germans had encamped, about 600 paces from them, and having drawn up his army in 3 lines, marched to that place. He ordered the first and second lines to be under arms, the third to fortify the camp. This place was distant from the enemy about 600 paces, as has been stated. Thither Ariovistus sent light troops, about 16,000 men in number, with all his cavalry, which forces were to intimidate our men and hinder them in their fortification. Cæsar, nevertheless, as he had before arranged, ordered 2 lines to drive off the enemy, the third to execute the work. The camp being fortified, he left there 2 legions and a portion of the auxiliaries, and led back the other 4 legions into the larger camp. The next day, according to his custom, Cæsar led out his forces from both camps, and having advanced a little from the larger one, drew up his line of battle, and gave the enemy an opportunity of fighting. When he found that they did not even then come out from their entrenchments, he led back his army into a camp about noon. Then at last Ariovistus sent part of his forces to attack the lesser camp. The battle was vigorously maintained on both sides till the evening. At sunset, after many wounds had been inflicted and received, Ariovistus led back his forces into camp. When Cæsar inquired of his prisoners wherefore Ariovistus did not come to an engagement, he discovered this to be the reason, that among the Germans it was the custom for their matrons to pronounce from lots and divination whether it were expedient that the battle should be engaged in or not, that they had said that it was not the will of heaven that the Germans should conquer if they engaged in battle before the new moon. The day following, Cæsar left what seemed sufficient as a guard for both camps, and then drew up all the auxiliaries in sight of the enemy before the lesser camp, because he was not very powerful in the number of legionary soldiers, considering the number of the enemy, that thereby he might make use of his auxiliaries for appearance. He himself, having drawn up his army in 3 lines, advanced to the camp of the enemy. Then at last, of necessity, the Germans drew their forces out of camp, and disposed them canton by canton at equal distances, the Harudis, Macomani, Trabocci, Vagiones, Nemetis, Seduci, Suevi, and surrounded their whole army with their chariots and wagons, that no hope might be left in flight. On these they placed their women, who, with dishevelled hair and in tears, entreated the soldiers, as they went forward to battle, not to deliver them into slavery to the Romans. Cæsar appointed over each legion a lieutenant and a quaestor, that every one might have them as witnesses of his valour. He himself began the battle at the head of the right wing, because he observed that part of the enemy to be the least strong. Accordingly, our men, upon the signal being given, vigorously made an attack upon the enemy, and the enemy so suddenly and rapidly rushed forward that there was no time for casting the javelins at them. Throwing aside, therefore, their javelins, they fought with swords hand to hand. But the Germans, according to their custom, rapidly forming a phalanx, sustained the attack of our swords. there were found very many of our soldiers who leaped upon the phalanx, and with their hands tore away the shields and wounded the enemy from above. Although the army of the enemy was routed on the left wing and put to flight, they still pressed heavily on our men from the right wing by the great number of their troops. On observing this, P. Crassus the younger, who commanded the cavalry, as he was more disengaged than those who were employed in the fight, sent the third line as a relief to our men who were in distress. Thereupon the engagement was renewed, and all the enemy turned their backs, nor did they cease to flee until their arrival at the river Rhine, about 50 miles from that place. There some few, either relying on their strength, endeavoured to swim over, or finding boats procured their safety. Among the latter was Ariovistus, who, meeting with a small vessel tied to the bank, escaped in it. Our horse pursued and slew all the rest of them. Ariovistus had 2 wives, one a Suevan by nation, whom he had brought with him from home, the other a Norican, the sister of King Vocion, whom he had married in Gaul, she having been sent hither for that purpose by her brother. Both perished in that flight. Of their 2 daughters, one was slain, the other captured. C. Valerius Procillus, as he was being dragged by his guards in the flight, bound with triple chains, fell into the hands of Cæsar himself, as he was pursuing the enemy with his cavalry. This circumstance indeed afforded Cæsar no less pleasure than the victory itself, because he saw a man of the first rank in the province of Gaul, his intimate acquaintance and friend, rescued from the hand of the enemy and restored to him, and that fortune had not diminished aught the joy and exultation of that day by his destruction. He, Procillus, said that in his own presence the lots had been thrice consulted respecting him, whether he should immediately be put to death by fire or be reserved for another time, that by the favour of the lots he was uninjured. And Medius was also found and brought back to him, Cæsar. This battle having been reported beyond the Rhine, the Suevi, who had come to the banks of that river, began to return home, when the Ubii, who dwelt nearest to the Rhine, pursuing them while much alarmed, slew a great number of them. Cæsar, having concluded 2 very important wars in one campaign, conducted his army into winter quarters among the Sequani a little earlier than the season of the year required. He appointed Labienus over the winter quarters, and set out in person for Hither Gaul to hold the assizes. End of section 39. Recording by Todd.
Section 40 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 7, by various authors. Section 40. On the Manners and Customs of Ancient Gauls and Germans, and the 2 Lieutenants from the Gallic Wars, and Epigram on Terentius, by Caius Julius Cæsar. On the Manners and Customs of Ancient Gauls and Germans, from the Gallic Wars. Since we have come to this place, it does not appear to be foreign to our subject to lay before the reader an account of the manners of Gaul and Germany, and wherein these nations differ from each other. In Gaul, there are factions not only in all the states and in all the cantons and their divisions, but almost in each family. And of these factions, those are the leaders who are considered according to their judgment to possess the greatest influence, upon whose will and determination the management of all affairs and measures depends. And that seems to have been instituted in ancient times with this view, that no one of the common people should be in want of support against one more powerful, for none of these leaders suffers his party to be oppressed and defrauded, and if he do otherwise, he has no influence among his party. This same policy exists throughout the whole of Gaul, for all the states are divided into 2 factions. When Cæsar arrived in Gaul, the Aedui were the leaders of one faction, the Sequani of the other. Since the latter were less powerful by themselves, inasmuch as the chief influence was from of old among the Aedui, and their dependencies were great, they had united to themselves the Germans and Ariovistus, and had brought them over to their party by great sacrifices and promises. And having fought several successful battles and slain all the nobility of the Aedui, they had so far surpassed them in power that they brought over from the Aedui to themselves a large portion of their dependents, and received from them the sons of their leading men as hostages, and compelled them to swear in their public character that they would enter into no design against them, and held a portion of the neighbouring land seized on by force, and possessed the sovereignty of the whole of Gaul. Divitiacus, urged by this necessity, had proceeded to Rome to the Senate for the purpose of entreating assistance, and had returned without accomplishing his object. A change of affairs ensued on the arrival of Cæsar. The hostages were returned to the Aedui, their old dependencies restored, and new ones acquired through Cæsar, because those who had attached themselves to the alliance saw that they enjoyed a better state and a milder government. Their other interests, their influence, their reputation were likewise increased, and in consequence the Sequani lost the sovereignty. The Remi succeeded to their place, and as it was perceived that they equalled the Aedui in favour with Cæsar, those who on account of their old animosities could by no means coalesce with the Aedui consigned themselves in clientship to the Remi. The latter carefully protected them. Thus they possessed both a new and suddenly acquired influence. Affairs were then in that position that the Aedui were considered by far the leading people, and the Remi held the second post of honour. Throughout all Gaul there are two orders of those men who are of any rank and dignity, for the commonalty is held almost in the condition of slaves, and dares to undertake nothing of itself, and is admitted to no deliberation. The greater part, when they are pressed either by debt, or the large amount of their tributes, or the oppression of the more powerful, give themselves up in vassalage to the nobles, who possess over them the same rights without exception as masters over their slaves. But of these two orders, one is that of the Druids, the other that of the Knights. The former are engaged in things sacred, conduct the public and the private sacrifices, and interpret all matters of religion. To these a large number of the young men resort for the purpose of instruction, and they, the Druids, are in great honour among them. For they determine respecting almost all controversies, public and private, and if any crime has been perpetrated, if murder has been committed, if there be any dispute about an inheritance, if any about boundaries, these same persons decide it. They decree rewards and punishments. If any one, either in a private or public capacity, has not submitted to their decision, they interdict him from the sacrifices. This among them is the most heavy punishment. Those who have been thus interdicted are esteemed in the number of the impious and criminal. All shun them and avoid their society and conversation, lest they receive some evil from their contact. Nor is justice administered to them when seeking it, nor is any dignity bestowed on them. Over all these Druids one presides, who possesses supreme authority among them. Upon his death, if any individual among the rest is preeminent in dignity, he succeeds, but if there are many equal, the election is made by the suffrages of the Druids. Sometimes they even contend for the presidency with arms. These assemble at a fixed period of the year in a consecrated place in the territories of the Carnutes, which is reckoned the central region of the whole of Gaul. Hither all who have disputes assemble from every part, and submit to their decrees and determinations. This institution is supposed to have been devised in Britain, and to have been brought over from it into Gaul. And now those who desire to gain a more accurate knowledge of that system generally proceed thither for the purpose of studying it. The Druids do not go to war, nor pay tribute together with the rest. They have an exemption from military service, and a dispensation in all matters. Induced by such great advantages, many embrace this profession of their own accord, and many are sent to it by their parents and relations. They are said there to learn by heart a great number of verses. Accordingly, some remain in the course of training 20 years. Nor do they regard it lawful to commit these to writing, though in almost all other matters, in their public and private transactions, they use Greek characters. That practice they seem to me to have adopted for two reasons: because they neither desire their doctrines to be divulged among the mass of the people, nor those who learn, to devote themselves the less to the efforts of memory, relying on writing, since it generally occurs to most men that in their dependence on writing they relax their diligence in learning thoroughly, and their employment of the memory. They wish to inculcate this as one of their leading tenets, that souls do not become extinct, but pass after death from one body to another, and they think that men by this tenet are in a great degree excited to valour, the fear of death being disregarded. They likewise discuss and impart to the youth many things respecting the stars and their motion, respecting the extent of the world and of our earth, respecting the nature of things, respecting the power and the majesty of the immortal gods. The other order is that of the knights. These, when there is occasion, and any war occurs, which before Cæsar's arrival was for the most part wont to happen every year, as either they on their part were inflicting injuries, or repelling those which others inflicted on them, are all engaged in war. and those of them most distinguished by birth and resources have the greatest number of vassals and dependents about them. They acknowledge this sort of influence and power only. The nation of all the Gauls is extremely devoted to superstitious rites, and on that account they who are troubled with unusually severe diseases, and they who are engaged in battles and dangers, either sacrifice men as victims, or vow that they will sacrifice them, and employ the Druids as the performers of those sacrifices, because they think that unless the life of a man be offered for the life of a man, the mind of the immortal gods cannot be rendered propitious, and they have sacrifices of that kind ordained for national purposes. Others have figures of vast size, the limbs of which formed of osiers they fill with living men, which being set on fire, the men perish enveloped in the flames. They consider that the oblation of such as have been taken in theft or in robbery or any other offense is more acceptable to the immortal gods, but when a supply of that class is wanting, they have recourse to the oblation of even the innocent. They worship as their divinity Mercury in particular, and have many images of him, and regard him as the inventor of all arts. They consider him the guide of their journeys and marches, and believe him to have a very great influence over the acquisition of gain and mercantile transactions. Next to him they worship Apollo, and Mars, and Jupiter, and Minerva. Respecting these deities, they have for the most part the same belief as other nations, that Apollo averts diseases, that Minerva imparts the invention of manufactures, that Jupiter possesses the sovereignty of the heavenly powers, that Mars presides over wars. To him, when they have determined to engage in battle, they commonly vow those things which they shall take in war. When they have conquered, they sacrifice whatever captured animals may have survived the conflict, and collect the other things into one place. In many states you may see piles of these things heaped up in their consecrated spots, nor does it often happen that any one, disregarding the sanctity of the case, dares either to secrete in his house things captured or take away those deposited, and the most severe punishment with torture has been established for such a deed. All the Gauls assert that they are descended from the god Dis, and say that this tradition has been handed down by the Druids. For that reason they compute the divisions of every season not by the number of days, but of nights. They keep birthdays and the beginnings of months and years in such an order that the day follows the night. Among the other usages of their life, they differ in this from almost all other nations, that they do not permit their children to approach them openly until they are grown up, so as to be able to bear the service of war, and they regard it as indecorous for a son of boyish age to stand in public in the presence of his father. Whatever sums of money the husbands have received in the name of dowry from their wives, making an estimate of it, they add the same amount out of their own estates. An account is kept of all this money conjointly, and the profits are laid by. Whichever of them shall have survived the other, to that one the portion of both reverts, together with the profits of the previous time. Husbands have power of life and death over their wives as well as over their children, and when the father of a family born in a more than commonly distinguished rank has died, his relations assemble, and if the circumstances of his death are suspicious, hold an investigation upon the wives in the manner adopted towards slaves, and if proof be obtained, put them to severe torture and kill them. Their funerals, considering the state of civilization among the Gauls, are magnificent and costly, and they cast into the fire all things, including living creatures, which they suppose to have been dear to them when alive. And a little before this period, slaves and dependents who were ascertained to have been beloved by them were, after the regular funeral rites were completed, burnt together with them. Those states which are considered to conduct their commonwealth more judiciously have it ordained by their laws that if any person shall have heard by rumour and report from his neighbours anything concerning the commonwealth, he shall convey it to the magistrate and not impart it to any other, because it has been discovered that inconsiderate and inexperienced men were often alarmed by false reports and driven to some rash act, or else took hasty measures in affairs of the highest importance. The magistrates conceal those things which require to be kept unknown, and they disclose to the people whatever they determine to be expedient. It is not lawful to speak of the commonwealth except in council. The Germans differ much from these usages, for they have neither Druids to preside over sacred offices, nor do they pay great regard to sacrifices. They rank in the number of the gods those alone whom they behold, and by whose instrumentality they are obviously benefited, namely, the sun, fire, and the moon. They have not heard of the other deities even by report. Their whole life is occupied in hunting and in the pursuits of the military art. From childhood they devote themselves to fatigue and hardships. Those who have remained chaste for the longest time receive the greatest commendation among their people. They think that by this the growth is promoted, by this the physical powers are increased and the sinews are strengthened. And to have had knowledge of woman before the 20th year they reckon among the most disgraceful acts, of which matter there is no concealment, because they bathe promiscuously in the rivers, and only use skins or small cloaks of deer's hides, a large portion of the body being in consequence naked. They do not pay much attention to agriculture, and a large portion of their food consists in milk, cheese, and flesh. Nor has any one a fixed quantity of land or his own individual limits. But the magistrates and the leading men each year apportion to the tribes and families who have united together as much land as, and in the place which, they think proper, and the year after compel them to remove elsewhere. For this enactment they advance many reasons, lest, seduced by long-continued custom, they may exchange their ardour in the waging of war for agriculture; lest they may be anxious to acquire extensive estates, and the more powerful drive the weaker from their possessions; lest they construct their houses with too great a desire to avoid cold and heat; lest the desire of wealth spring up, from which cause divisions and discords arise; and that they may keep the common people in a contented state of mind, when each sees his own means placed on an equality with those of the most powerful. It is the greatest glory to the several states to have as wide deserts as possible around them, their frontiers having been laid waste. They consider this the real evidence of their prowess, that their neighbours shall be driven out of their lands and abandon them, and that no one dare settle near them. At the same time they think that they shall be on that account the more secure, because they have removed the apprehension of a sudden incursion. When a state either repels war waged against it, or wages it against another, the magistrates are chosen to preside over that war with such authority that they have power of life and death. In peace there is no common magistrate, but the chiefs of provinces and cantons administer justice and determine controversies among their own people. Robberies which are committed beyond the boundaries of each state bear no infamy, and they avow that these are committed for the purpose of disciplining their youth and of preventing sloth. And when any of their chiefs has said in an assembly that he will be their leader, let those who are willing to follow give in their names. They who approve of both the enterprise and the man arise and promise their assistance, and are applauded by the people. Such of them as have not followed him are accounted in the number of deserters and traitors, and confidence in all matters is afterwards refused them. To injure guests they regard as impious. They defend from wrong those who have come to them for any purpose whatever, and esteem them inviolable. To them the houses of all are open, and maintenance is freely supplied. And there was formerly a time when the Gauls excelled the Germans in prowess, and waged war on them offensively, and on account of the great number of their people, and the insufficiency of their land, sent colonies over the Rhine. Accordingly, the Volcae Tectosages seized on these parts of Germany, which are the most fruitful, and lie around the Hercynian forest, which I perceive was known by report to Eratosthenes and some other Greeks, and which they called Orsinia, and settled there. Which nation to this time retains its position in those settlements, and has a very high character for justice and military merit. Now also they continue in the same scarcity, indigence, hardihood as the Germans, and use the same food and dress. But their proximity to the province and knowledge of commodities from countries beyond the sea supplies to the Gauls many things tending to luxury as well as civilization. Accustomed by degrees to be overmatched and worsted in many engagements, they do not even compare themselves to the Germans in prowess. The breadth of this Hercynian forest, which has been referred to above, is, to a quick traveller, a journey of 9 days. For it cannot be otherwise computed, nor are they acquainted with the measures of roads. It begins at the frontiers of the Helvetii, Nemetes, and Rorasi, and extends in a straight line along the river Danube to the territories of the Daci and the Anartes. It bends thence to the left in a different direction from the river, and owing to its extent touches the confines of many nations. Nor is there any person belonging to this part of Germany who says that he either has gone to the extremity of that forest, though he had advanced a journey of 60 days, or has heard in what place it begins. It is certain that many kinds of wild beasts are produced in it, which have not been seen in other parts, of which the following are such as differ principally from other animals, and appear worthy of being committed to record. There is an ox of the shape of a stag, between whose ears a horn rises from the middle of the forehead, higher and straighter than those horns which are known to us. From the top of this, branches like palms stretch out a considerable distance. The shape of the female and of the male is the same, the appearance and the size of the horns is the same. There are also animals which are called elks. The shape of these and the varied color of their skins is much like roes, but in size they surpass them a little, and are destitute of horns, and have legs without joints and ligatures, nor do they lie down for the purpose of rest, nor, if they have been thrown down by any accident, can they raise or lift themselves up. Trees serve as beds to them. They lean themselves against them, and thus, reclining only slightly, they take their rest. When the huntsmen have discovered from the footsteps of these animals whither they are accustomed to betake themselves, they either undermine all the trees at the roots, or cut into them so far that the upper part of the trees may appear to be left standing. When they have leant upon them, according to their habit, they knock down by their weight the unsupported trees, and fall down themselves along with them. There is a third kind, consisting of those animals which are called uri. These are a little below the elephant in size, and of the appearance, color, and shape of a bull. Their strength and speed are extraordinary. They spare neither man nor wild beast which they have espied. These the Germans take with much pains in pits, and kill them. The young men harden themselves with this exercise, and practise themselves in this kind of hunting, and those who have slain the greatest number of them, having produced the horns in public to serve as evidence, receive great praise. But not even when taken very young can they be rendered familiar to men and tamed. The size, shape, and appearance of their horns differ much from the horns of our oxen. These they, the Gauls, anxiously seek after, and bind at the tips with silver, and use as cups at their most sumptuous entertainments. The two lieutenants from the Gallic wars. In that legion there were two very brave men, centurions, who were now approaching the first ranks, T. Pulfio and L. Varenus. These used to have continual disputes between them which of them should be preferred, and every year used to contend for promotion with the utmost animosity. When the fight was going on most vigorously before the fortifications, Pulfio, one of them, says, "Why do you hesitate, Varenus? Or what better opportunity of signalizing your valor do you seek? This very day shall decide our disputes." When he had uttered these words, he proceeds beyond the fortifications, and rushes on that part of the enemy which appeared the thickest. Nor does Varenus remain within the rampart, but respecting the high opinion of all, follows close after. Then, when an inconsiderable space intervened, Pulfio throws his javelin at the enemy, and pierces one of the multitude who was running up. And while the latter was wounded and slain, the enemy cover him with their shields, and all throw their weapons at the other, and afford him no opportunity of retreating. The shield of Pulfio is pierced, and a javelin is fastened in his belt. This circumstance turns aside his scabbard, and obstructs his right hand when attempting to draw his sword. The enemy crowd around him when thus embarrassed. His rival runs up to him, and succours him in this emergency. Immediately the whole host turn from Pulfio to him, supposing the other to be pierced through by the javelin. Varenus rushes on briskly with his sword, and carries on the combat hand to hand, and having slain one man, for a short time drove back the rest. While he urges on too eagerly, slipping into a hollow, he fell. To him in his turn, when surrounded, Pulfio brings relief, and both, having slain a great number, retreat into the fortifications amidst the highest applause. Fortune so dealt with both in this rivalry and conflict, that the one competitor was a succour and safeguard to the other, nor could it be determined which of the two appeared worthy of being preferred to the other. Epigram on Terentius. This sole fragment of literary criticism from the dictator's hand is preserved on the Suetonian life of Terence. Two of Cæsar's brief but masterly letters to Cicero will be quoted under the latter name. You, moreover, although you are but the half of Menander, lover of diction pure, with the first have a place, and with reason. Would that vigour as well to your gentle writing were added. So your comic force would in equal glory have rivalled even the Greeks themselves, though now you ignobly are vanquished. Truly I sorrow and grieve that you lack this only, O Terence. End of section 40.
Section number 41 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 7, by various authors. Section 41. Pete Quilliam's Firstborn, from The Manxman, by Thomas Henry Hall Caine. From The Manxman, copyrighted 1894 by D. Appleton and Company. Pete went up to Sulby like an avalanche, shouting his greetings to everybody on the way. But when he got near to the ferry, he wiped his steaming forehead and held his panting breath, and pretended not to have heard the news. "How's the poor girl now?" he said in a meek voice, trying to look powerfully miserable, and playing his part splendidly for 30 seconds. Then the women made eyes at each other, and looked wondrous, knowing, and nodded sideways at Pete, and clucked and chuckled, saying, "Look at him, he doesn't know anything, does he? Course not, woman, these men creatures are no use for nothing." "Out of a man's way!" cried Pete with a roar, and he made a rush for the stairs. Nancy blocked him at the foot of them with both hands on his shoulders. "You'll be quiet then," she whispered. "You were always a reasonable man, Pete, and she's wonderful weak. Promise you'll be quiet." "I'll be like a mouse," said Pete, and he wiped off his long sea boots and crept on tiptoe into the room. There she lay with the morning light on her, and a face as white as the quilt that she was plucking with her long fingers. "Thank God for a living mother and a living child," said Pete in a broken gurgle, and then he drew down the bedclothes a very little, and there too was the child on the pillow of her other arm. Then, do what he would to be quiet, he could not help but make a shout. "He's there! Yes, he is! He is, though! Joy! Joy!" The women were down on him like a flock of geese. "Out of this, sir, if you can't behave better." "Excuse me, ladies," said Pete humbly. "I'm not in the habit of babies. A bit excited, you see. Mistress Nancy, ma'am, couldn't help putting a bull of a roar out, not being used of the like." Then turning back to the bed, "Ah, Kitty, the beauty it is, though! And the big as my fist already. And the fat, it's as fat as a bluebottle. And the straight, well, not so very straight, neither, but the complexion at him now. Give him to me, Kitty, give him to me, the young rascal. Let me have a hold of him anyway." "Him, indeed! Listen to the man," said Nancy. "It's a girl, Pete," said Grannie, lifting the child out of the bed. "A girl, is it?" said Pete doubtfully. "Well," he said, with a wag of the head, "thank God for a girl." Then, with another and more resolute wag, "Yes, thank God for a living mother and a living child, if it is a girl." And he stretched out his arms to take the baby. "Aisy now, Pete, aisy," said Grannie, holding it out to him. "Is it aisy broke they are, Grannie?" said Pete. A good spirit looked out of his great boyish face. "Come to your old daddy, you little sandpiper. God bless me, Kitty, the weight of him, though. This child's a quarter of 100 if he's an ounce. He is. I'll go bail he is. Look at him, gahang, Grannie. Did ye ever see the like? Now, it's absolute perfection, Kitty. I couldn't have had a better one if I'd chiced it. Where's that Tom Hommy now? The bleating little billygoat. He was bragging outrageous about his new baby, saying he wouldn't part with it for 2 of the best cows in his cowhouse. This'll floor him, I'm thinking. What's that you're saying, Mistress Nancy, ma'am? No good for nothing, am I? You were right, Grannie. It'll be all joy soon, you were saying. And haven't we the child to show for it? I put on my stocking inside out on Monday, ma'am. I'm in luck, says I, and so I was. Look at that now. He's shaking his little fist at his father, he is, though. This child knows me. Ah, you're clever, Nancy, but no nonsense at all, Mistress Nancy, ma'am. Nothing will persuade me, but this child knows me." "Do you hear the man?" said Nancy. "He, and he, and he, and he! It's a girl, I'm telling you, a girl, a girl, a girl!" "Well, well, a girl, then a girl we'll make it," said Pete, with determined resignation. "He's deceived," said Grannie. "It was a boy he was wanting, poor fellow." But Pete scoffed at the idea. "A boy? No, no, a girl for your life. I'm all for girls myself, eh, Kitty? Always was, and now I've got two of them." The child began to cry, and Grannie took it back and rocked it, face downwards, across her knees. "Goodness me, the voice at him!" said Pete. "It's a skipper he's born for, a harbour master anyway." The child slept, and Grannie put it on the pillow, turned lengthwise at Kate's side. "Quiet as a Jenny Wren now," said Pete. "Look at the bull, smiling in his sleep, just like a baby mermaid on the egg of a dogfish. But where's the ould man at all? Has he seen it? We must have it in the papers. The Times? Yes, and the Tiser too. The beloved wife of Mr. Captain Peter Quilliam, of a boy, a girl, I mean. Ah, the wonder! There'll be all the island over, everybody getting to know. Newspapers are like women, terrible bad for keeping secrets. What'll Philip say?" There was a low moaning from the bed. "Air! Give me air! Open the door!" Kate gasped. "The room is getting too hot for her," said Grannie. "Come, there's one too many of us here," said Nancy. "Out of it!" And she swept Pete from the bedroom with her apron as if he had been a drove of ducks. Pete glanced backward from the door, and a cloak that was hanging on the inside of it brushed his face. "God bless her!" he said in a low tone. "God bless and reward her for going through this for me." Then he touched the cloak with his lips and disappeared. A moment later his curly black poll came stealing round the door jamb halfway down, like the head of a big boy. "Nancy," in a whisper, "put the tongs over the cradle. It's a pity to tempt the fairies. And, Grannie, I wouldn't lave it alone to go out to the cowhouse. The little people are shocking bad for changing." End of Section 41. Section 42 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 7, by various authors. Section 42. Biographical Note on Pedro Calderon, by Maurice Francis Egan. Pedro Calderon, 1600 to 1681. The reputation of Pedro Calderon de la Barca has suffered in the minds of English-speaking people from the injudicious comparisons of critics, as well as from lack of knowledge of his works. To put Calderon, a master of invention, beside Shakespeare, the master of character, and to show by analogies that the author of Othello was far superior to the writer the physician of his own honor, is unjust to Calderon, and it is as futile as are the ecstasies of Schultz to the coldness of Sismondi. Schultz compares Dante with him, and the French critics have only recently forgiven him for being less classical in form than Corneille, who, in Le Cid, gave them all the Spanish poetry they wanted. Fortunately, the student of Calderon need not take opinions. Good editions of Calderon are easily attainable. The best known are Heil's, Leipzig, 1827, and that by Hartzenbusch, Madrid, 1848. The first edition, with forewords by Vera Tassis de Villarreal, appeared at Madrid, 9 volumes, in 1682–91. Commentaries and translations are numerous in German and in English. The translations by Denis Florence MacCarthy are the most satisfactory, Edward Fitzgerald's being too paraphrastic. Dean Trench added much to our knowledge of Calderon's best work. George Ticknor in The History of Spanish Literature and George Henry Lewes in The Spanish Drama left us clear estimates of Lope de Vega's great successor. Shelley's scenes from El Magico Prodigicio are superb. No analyses can do justice to the dramas, or to the religious plays, called autos by Calderon. They must be read, and thanks to the late Mr. McCarthy's sympathy and zeal, the finest are easily attainable. As he left 73 autos and 108 dramas, it is lucky that the work of sifting the best from the mass of varying merit has been carefully done. Mr. Ticknor mentions the fact that Calderon collaborated with other authors in the writing of 14 other plays. Calderon was not the Spanish Shakespeare. The Spanish Ben Jonson would be a happier title, if one feels obliged to compare everything with something else. But Calderon is as far above Ben Jonson in splendor of imagery as he is below Shakespeare in his knowledge of the heart, and in that vitality which makes Hamlet and Orlando, Lady Macbeth and Perdita, men and women of all time. They live. Calderon's people, like Ben Jonson's, move. There is a resemblance between the autos of Calderon and the masques of Jonson. Jonson's are lyrical, Calderon's less lyrical than splendid, ethical, grandiose. They were both court poets, they both made court spectacles, they both assisted in the decay of the drama, they reflected the tastes of their time. But Calderon is the more noble, the more splendid in imagination, the more intense in his devotion to nature in all her moods. If one wanted to carry the habit of comparison into music, Mozart might well represent the spirit of Calderon. M. Filleretti Chazelle is right when he says that El Magico Prodigicio should be presented in a cathedral. Calderon's genius had the cast of the soldier and the priest, and he was both soldier and priest. His comedias and autos are of Spain, Spanish. To know Calderon is to know the mind of the Spain of the 17th century. To know Cervantes is to know its heart. The Church had opposed the secularization of the drama at the end of the 15th century for two reasons. The dramatic spectacle fostered for religious purposes had become, until Lope de Vega rescued it, a medium for that naturalism which some of us fancy to be a discovery of M. Zola and M. Catulle Mendès. It had escaped from the control of the Church and had become a mere diversion. Calderon was the one man who could unite the spirit of religion to the form of the drama which the secular Renaissance imperiously demanded. He knew the philosophy of Aristotle and the theology of the Summa of St. Thomas as well as any cleric in Spain, though he did not take orders until late in life. And in those religious spectacles called autos sacramentales, he showed this knowledge wonderfully. His last auto was unfinished when he died on May 25, 1681, 65 years after the death of Shakespeare, and Don Melchior de Leon completed it, probably in time for the feast of Corpus Christi. The auto was an elaboration of the older miracle play, and a spectacle as much in keeping with the temper of the Spanish court and people as Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream or Ben Jonson's Fortunate Isles was in accord with the tastes of the English. And Calderon, of all Spanish poets, best pleased his people. He was the favorite poet of the court under Philip IV, and director of the theatre in the palace of the Buen Retiro. The skill in the art of construction, which he had begun to acquire when he wrote The Devotion of the Cross at the age of 19, was turned to stage management at the age of 35, when he produced his gorgeous pageant of Circe on the pond of the Buen Retiro. How elaborate this spectacle was, the direction for the prelude of the greater splendor to come will show. They read in this way: In the midst of this island, will be situated a very lofty mountain of rugged ascent, with precipices and caverns, surrounded by a thick and darksome wood of tall trees, some of which will be seen to exhibit the appearance of the human form, covered with a rough bark, from the heads and arms of which will issue green boughs and branches, having suspended from them various trophies of war and of the chase, the theatre during the opening of the scene being scantily lit with concealed lights. And to make a beginning of the festival, a murmuring and a rippling noise of water having been heard, a great and magnificent car will be seen to advance along the pond, plated over with silver, and drawn by two monstrous fishes, from whose mouth will continually issue great jets of water, the light of the theatre increasing according as they advance, and on the summit of it will be seen seated in great pomp and majesty the goddess Aqua, from whose head and curious vesture will issue an infinite abundance of little conduits of water, and at the same time will be seen another great supply flowing from an urn which the goddess will hold reversed, and which, filled with a variety of fishes, leaping and playing in the torrent as it descends and gliding over all the car, will fall into the pond. This Circe was allegorical and mythological. It was one of those soulless shows which mark the transition of the Spanish drama from maturity to decay. It is gone and forgotten with thousands of its kind. Calderon will be remembered not as the director of such vain pomps, but as the author of the sublime and tender, wonderful magician, the weird Purgatory of St. Patrick, the Constant Prince, the Secret in Words, and the Physician of his own honor. The scrupulous student of the Spanish drama will demand more, but for him who would love Calderon without making a deep study of his works, these are sufficiently characteristic of his genius at its highest. The reader in search of wider vistas should add to these Los Encantos de la Culpa, The Sorceries of Sin, and The Great Theatre of the World, the theme of which is that of Jacques' famous speech in As You Like It. En el teatro del mundo todos son representados. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. On the principal feasts of the church, autos were played in the streets, generally in front of some great house. Giants and grotesque figures called tarascas gamboled about, and the auto, which was more like our operas than any other composition of the Spanish stage, was begun by a loa written or sung. After this came the play, then an amusing interlude, followed by music and sometimes a dance of gypsies. Calderon boldly mingles pagan gods and Christ's mysteries in these autos, which are essentially of his time and his people, but the mixture is not so shocking as it is with the lesser poet, the Portuguese Camões. Whether Calderon depicts the true god Pan, love the greatest enchantment, or the sheaves of Ruth, he is forceful, dramatic, and even at times he has the awful gravity of Dante. His view of life and his philosophy are the view of life and the philosophy of Dante. To many of us, these simple and original productions of the Spanish temperament and genius may lack what we call human interest. Let us remember that they represented truthfully the faith and the hope, the spiritual knowledge of a nation, as well as the personal and national view of that knowledge. In the Spain of Calderon, the personal view was the national view. Calderon was born on January 17th, 1600. According to his own statement, quoted by his friend Vera Tassis, at Madrid, of noble parents. He was partly educated at the University of Salamanca. Like Cervantes and Garcilaso, he served in the army. The great Lope, in 1630, acknowledged him as a poet and his friend. Later, his transition from the army to the priesthood made little change in his views of time and eternity. On May 25, 1881, occurred the second centenary of his death, and the civilized world, whose theatre owes much to Calderon than it has ever acknowledged, celebrated with Spain the anniversary at Madrid, where, as he said, "Spain's proud heart swelleth." The selections have been chosen from Shelley's Scenes and from Mr. McCarthy's translation of The Secret in Words. The Secret in Words is light comedy of intricate plot. Fabio is an example of the attendant gracioso, half servant, half confidant, who appears often in the Spanish drama. The Spanish playwright did not confine himself to one form of verse, and Mr. McCarthy, in his adequate translation, has followed the various forms of Calderon, only not attempting the assonant vowel, so hard to escape in Spanish, and still harder to reproduce in English. These selections give no impression of the amazing invention of Calderon. This can only be appreciated through reading The Constant Prince, the physician of his own honor, or a comedy like The Secret in Words. End of Section 42.
Section 43 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 7, by various authors. Section 43. Selected excerpts by Pedro Calderon.
The Lovers, from The Secret in Words. Narrator, read by Sonia.
Frederick, read by John Burlinson.
Fabio, read by Tony Addison.
Florida, the Duchess of Parma, is in love with her secretary Frederick. He loves her lady, Laura. Both Frederick and Laura are trying to keep their secret from the Duchess.
Has Florida questioned you aught about my love?
No, surely. But I have made up my mind that you are the prince of dunces not to understand her wish.
Said she something, then, about me?
Ay, enough.
Thou liest, knave. Wouldst thou make me think her beauty, proud and gentle though it be, which might soar in like the heron to the sovereign sun itself, could descend with coward pinions at a lowly falcon's call?
Well, my lord, just make the trial for a day or two. Pretend that you love her, and—
Supposing that there were the slightest ground for this false malicious fancy you have formed, there's not a chink in my heart where it might enter, since a love, if not more blessed, far more equal than the other, holds entire possession there.
Then you never loved this woman at one time?
No.
Then avow.
What?
That you were very lazy.
That is falsehood and not love.
The more the merrier.
In two places how could one man love?
Why, thus. Near the town of Ratisbon, two conspicuous hamlets lay, one of them called Agaray, the other called Mascarandon. These two villages one priest, an humble man of God, 'tis stated, served, and therefore celebrated mass in each on every feast. And so one day it came to pass, a native of Mascarandon, who to Agaray had gone, about the middle of the mass, heard the priest in solemn tone say, as he the preface read, Gratias Agaray, but said nothing of Mascarandon. To the priest this worthy made his angry plaint without delay, You give best thanks for Agaray, as if your tithes we had not paid. When this sapient reason reached the noble Mascarandonese, they stopped their hopeless pastor's fees, nor paid for what he prayed or preached. He asked his sacristan the cause, who told him wherefore, and because from that day forth, when he would sing the preface, he took care to intone, not in a smothered or weak way, tibi semper et ubique gratias mascarandon, if from love that God so blind two parishes thou holdest, you are bound to gratify the two, and after a few days you'll find, if you do so, soon upon you and me will fall good things, when your lordship sweetly sings Flarida et mascarandum.
Think you I have heard your folly?
If you listened, why not so?
No, my mind can only know its one call of melancholy.
Since you stick to Agare and reject mascarandum, every hope, I fear, is gone, that love his generous dues will pay.
Translation of Dennis Florence McCarthy.
Cyprian's Bargain, from The Wonderful Magician. Narrated by John Burlinson. Cyprian, read by John Burlinson.
Justina, read by Sonia.
Demon, read by Tony Addison.
Lysander, read by John Burlinson.
Olivia, read by Tony Addison.
The demon, angered by Cyprian's victory in defending the existence of God, swears vengeance. He resolves that Cyprian shall lose his soul for Justina, who rejects his love. Cyprian says, "So bitter is the life I live that, hear me, hell, I now would give to thy most detested spirit my soul forever to inherit, to suffer punishment and pine, so this woman may be mine." The demon accepts his soul and hastens to Justina.
"'Tis that enamoured nightingale who gives me the reply. He ever tells the same soft tale of passion and of constancy to his mate, who, rapt and fond, listening sits a bough beyond. Be silent, nightingale! No more make me think, in hearing thee thus tenderly thy love deplore, if a bird can feel his soul, what a man would feel for me. And voluptuous vine, O thou who seekest most when least pursuing, to the trunk thou interlacest art the verdure which embracest and the weight which is its ruin. No more with green embraces, vine, make me think on what thou lovest, for while thou thus thy boughs entwine, I fear lest thou shouldst teach me, sophist, how arms might be entangled too. Light enchanted sunflower, thou who gazest ever true and tender on the sun's revolving splendour, follow not his faithless glance with thy faded countenance, nor teach my beating heart to fear if leaves can mourn without a tear, how eyes must weep. O nightingale, cease from thy enamoured tale. Leafy vine, unwreathe thy bower. Restless sunflower, cease to move. Or tell me all what poisonous power ye use against me.
Love, love, love.
It cannot be. Whom have I ever loved? Trophies of my oblivion and disdain, Floro and Lelio, did I not reject? And Cyprian?
She becomes troubled at the name of Cyprian.
Did I not requite him with such severity that he has fled where none has ever heard of him again? Alas! I now begin to fear that this may be the occasion whence desire grows bold, as if there were no danger. From the moment that I pronounce to my own listening heart, Cyprian is absent, O miserable me! I know not what I feel.
More calmly.
It must be pity to think that such a man, whom all the world admired, should be forgot by all the world, and I the cause.
She again becomes troubled.
And yet if it were pity, Floro and Lelio might have equal share, for they are both imprisoned for my sake.
Calmly.
Alas! What reasonings are these? It is enough I pity him, and that in vain, without this ceremonious subtlety. And woe is me! I know not where to find him now, even should I seek him through this wide world.
Enter Demon.
Follow, and I will lead thee where he is.
And who art thou? who has found entrance hither into my chamber through the doors and locks? Art thou a monstrous shadow which my madness has formed in the idle air?
No, I am one, called by the thought which tyrannizes thee from his eternal dwelling, who this day is pledged to bear thee unto Cyprian.
So shall thy promise fail. This agony of passion which afflicts my heart and soul may sweep imagination in its storm. The will is firm.
Already half is done in the imagination of an act. The sin incurred, the pleasure then remains. Let not the will stop half-way on the road.
I will not be discouraged, nor despair. Although I thought it, and although 'tis true that thought is but a prelude to the deed, thought is not in my power, but action is. I will not move my foot to follow thee.
But a far mightier wisdom than thine own exerts itself within thee, with such power compelling thee to that which it inclines, that it shall force thy step. How wilt thou then resist, Justina?
By my free will.
I must force thy will.
It is invincible. It were not free if thou hadst power upon it.
He draws, but cannot move her.
Come where a pleasure waits thee.
It were bought too dear.
'Twill soothe thy heart to softest peace.
'Tis dread captivity.
'Tis joy, 'tis glory.
'Tis shame, 'tis torment, 'tis despair.
But how canst thou defend thyself from that, or me, if my power drags thee onward?
My defence consists in God.
He vainly endeavours to force her, and at last releases her.
Woman, thou hast subdued me, only by not owning thyself subdued. But since thou thus findest defence in God, I will assume a feigned form, and thus make thee a victim of my baffled rage. For I will mask a spirit in thy form, who will betray thy name to infamy, and doubly shall I triumph in thy loss, first by dishonouring thee, and then by turning false pleasure to true ignominy.
Exit.
I appeal to heaven against thee, so that heaven may scatter thy delusions, and the blot upon my fame vanish in idle thought, even as flame dies in the envious air, and as the floweret wanes at morning frost, and thou shouldst never— But alas! To whom do I still speak? Did not a man but now stand here before me? No, I am alone, and yet I saw him. Is he gone so quickly? Or can the heated mind engender shapes from its own fear? Some terrible and strange peril is near. Lysander! Father! Lord! Livia!
Enter Lysander and Livia. O my daughter, what?
What?
Saw you a man go forth from my apartment now? I scarce sustain myself.
A man here?
Have you not seen him?
No, lady.
I saw him.
'Tis impossible. The doors which led to this apartment were all locked. Livia aside.
I dare say it was Moscone whom she saw, for he was locked up in my room.
It must have been some image of thy fantasy. Such melancholy as thou feedest is skilful in forming such in the vain air, out of the motes and atoms of the day.
My master's in the right.
Oh, would it were delusion! But I fear some greater ill. I feel as if out of my bleeding bosom my heart was torn in fragments. Ay, some mortal spell is wrought against my frame. So potent was the charm, that had not God shielded my humble innocence from wrong, I should have sought my sorrow and my shame with willing steps. Livia, quick, bring my cloak, for I must seek refuge from these extremes, even in the temple of the highest God, which secretly the faithful worship.
Here.
Justina, putting on her cloak.
In this, as in a shroud of snow, may I quench the consuming fire in which I burn, wasting away.
And I will go with thee. Livia aside.
When I once see them safe out of the house, I shall breathe freely.
So do I confide in thy just favour, Heaven.
Let us go.
Thine is the cause, great God. Turn for my sake, and for thine own, mercifully to me.
Translation of Shelley.
Dreams and Realities. From Such Stuff as Dreams Are Made Of. Edward Fitzgerald's version of La Vida es Sueño. Narrated by Tony Addison.
Clotaldo, read by John Burlinson.
Segismund, read by Sonia.
The scene is a tower. Clotaldo is persuading Segismund that his experiences have not been real but dreams, and discusses the possible relation of existence to a state of dreaming. The play itself is based on the familiar motif, of which Christopher Sly furnishes a ready example.
Princes and princesses and counsellors flustered to right and left. My life made at, but that was nothing. Even the white-haired venerable king seized on. Indeed, you made wild work of it, and so discovered in your outward action, flinging your arms about you in your sleep, grinding your teeth, and, as I now remember, woke mouthing out judgment and execution on those about you.
I did indeed.
Even your eyes stare wild, your hair stands up, your pulses throb and flutter, reeling still under the storm of such a dream.
A dream. That seemed as swearable reality as what I wake in now.
Aye, wondrous how imagination in a sleeping brain out of the uncontingent senses draws sensations strong as from the real touch, that we not only laugh aloud and drench with tears our pillow, but in the agony of some imaginary conflict fight and struggle, even as you did. Some, 'tis thought, under the dreamt-of stroke of death have died.
And what's so very strange, too, in that world where place as well as people all was strange, even I almost as strange unto myself, you only, you, Clotaldo, you as much and palpably yourself as now you are, came in this very garb you ever wore, by such a token of the past, you said, to assure me of that seeming present.
Aye?
Aye, and even told me of the very stars you tell me hereof, how in spite of them I was enlarged to all that glory.
Aye, by the false spirit's nice contrivance thus, a little truth oft leavens all the false, the better to delude us.
For you know 'tis nothing but a dream?
Nay, you yourself know best how lately you awoke from that you know you went to sleep on. Why, have you never dreamt the like before?
Never to such reality.
Such dreams are oftentimes the sleeping exhalations of that ambition that lies smouldering under the ashes of the lowest fortune, by which, when reason slumbers, or has lost the reins of sensible comparison, we fly at something higher than we are, scarce ever dive to lower, to be kings or conquerors, crowned with laurel or with gold, nay, mounting heaven itself on eagle wings, which, by the way, now that I think of it, may furnish us the key to this high flight, that royal eagle we were watching and talking of as you went to sleep last night.
Last night? Last night?
Aye, do you not remember envying his immunity of flight, as, rising from his throne of rock, he sailed above the mountains far into the west that burned about him, while with poising wings he darkled in it as a burning brand is seen to smoulder in the fire it feeds.
Last night. Oh, what a day was that between that last night and this sad to-day.
And yet perhaps only some few dark moments, into which imagination, once lit up within and unconditional of time and space, can pour infinities.
And I remember how the old man they called the king, who wore the crown of gold about his silver hair and the mysterious girdle round his waist, just when my rage was roaring at its height, and after which it all was dark again, bade me beware lest all should be a dream.
Aye, they're another specialty of dreams, that once the dreamer begins to dream, he dreams his foot is on the very verge of waking.
Would that it had been on the verge of death that knows no waking, lifting me up to glory, to fall back, stunned, crippled, wretcheder than even before.
Yet not so glorious, Sigismund, if you your visionary honour wore so ill as to work murder and revenge on those who meant you well.
Who meant me their prince, chained like a felon.
Stay, not so fast. You dreamed the prince, remember?
Then in dream revenged it only.
True, but as they say, dreams are rough copies of the waking soul, yet uncorrected of the higher will, so that men sometimes in their dream confess an unsuspected or forgotten self. One must beware to check, aye, if one may, stifle airborne such passion in ourselves as make we see such havoc with our sleep, and ill reacts upon the waking day. And by the by, for one test, Sigismund, between such swearable realities, since dreaming, madness, passion are akin in missing each that salutary rein of reason and the guiding will of man, one test, I think, of waking sanity shall be that conscious power of self-control to curb all passion, but most of all, that evil and vindictive, that ill squares with human, and with holy canon less, which binds us pardon even our enemies, and much more those who, out of no ill will, mistakenly have taken up the rod which heaven, they think, has put into their hands.
I think I soon shall have to try again. Sleep has not yet done with me.
Such a sleep! Take my advice. 'Tis early yet, the sun scarce up above the mountain. Go within, and if the light deceived you, try anew with morning. Morning dreams, they say, come true.
Oh, rather pray for me a sleep so fast as shall obliterate dream, and waking too.
Exit into the tower.
So sleep fast, and sleep away those 2 night potions and the waking dream between, which dream thou must believe. And if to see again poor Sigismund, that dream must be, and yet, in these our ghostly lives, half night, half day, half sleeping, half awake, how if our waking life, like that of sleep, be all a dream in that eternal life to which we wake not till we sleep in death? How if, I say, the senses we now trust for date of sensible comparison, aye, even the reason's self that dates with them, should be in essence of intensity hereafter so transcended, and awoke to a perceptive subtlety so keen, as to confess themselves befooled before, in all that now they will avouch for most? One man like this, but only so much longer as life is longer than a summer's day, believed himself a king upon his throne, and played at hazard with his fellows' lives, who cheaply dreamed away their lives to him. The sailor dreamed of tossing on the flood, the soldier of his laurels grown in blood. The lover of the beauty that he knew must yet dissolve to dusty residue. The merchant and the miser of his bags of fingered gold, the beggar of his rags. And all this stage of earth on which we seem such busy actors, and the parts we played substantial as the shadow of a shade, and dreaming but a dream within a dream. The dream called life. Sigismund's speech closing the Vida es Sueño, Fitzgerald's version. Narrated by John Burlinson.
Sigismund, read by Tony Addison. A dream it was in which I found myself, and you that hail me now then hailed me king, in a brave palace that was all my own, within and all without it mine, until drunk with excess of majesty and pride, methought I towered so high and swelled so wide, that of myself I burst the glittering bubble which my ambition had about me blown, and all again was darkness. Such a dream as this, in which I may be walking now, dispensing solemn justice to you shadows, who make believe to listen, but anon kings, princes, captains, warriors, plume and steel, ay, even with all your airy theatre, may flit into the air you seem to rend with acclamations, leaving me to wake in the dark tower, or dreaming that I wake. From this that waking is, or this and that, both waking or both dreaming. Such a doubt confounds and clouds our mortal life about. But whether wake or dreaming, this I know, how dream-wise human glories come and go, whose momentary tenure not to break, walking as one who knows he soon may wake. So fairly carry the full cup, so well disordered insolence and passion quell, that there be nothing after to upbraid dreamer or doer in the party played, whether tomorrow's dawn shall break the spell, or the last trumpet of the eternal day, when dreaming with the night shall pass away.
End of section 43.
Section 44 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anthony Patch, Memphis, Tennessee. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 7, by various authors. Section 44. John Caldwell Calhoun, 1782 to 1850, by W. P. Trent. John C. Calhoun's importance as a statesman has naturally stood in the way of his recognition as a writer, and in like manner his reputation as an orator has overshadowed his just claims to be considered our most original political thinker. The 6 volumes of his collected works, which unfortunately do not embrace his still inaccessible private correspondence, are certainly not exhilarating or attractive reading, but they are unique in the literature of America, if not of the world, as models of passionless logical analysis. Whether passionless logical analysis is ever an essential quality of true literature is a matter on which opinions will differ, but until the question is settled in the negative, Calhoun's claims to be considered a writer of marked force and originality cannot be ignored. It is true that circumstances have invalidated much of his political teaching, and that it was always negative and destructive rather than positive and constructive. It is true also that much of the interest attaching to his works is historical rather than literary in character, but when all allowances are made, it will be found that the Disquisition on Government must still be regarded as the most remarkable political treatise our country has produced, and that the position of its author as the head of a school of political thought is commanding and in a way unassailable. The precise character of Calhoun's political philosophy, the keynote of which was the necessity and means of defending the rights of minorities, cannot be understood without a brief glance at his political career. His birth in 1782, just after the Revolution, and in South Carolina gave him the opportunity to share in the victory that the West and the far South won over the Virginians, headed by Madison. His training at Yale gave a nationalistic bias to his early career, and determined that search for the via media between consolidation and anarchy which resulted in the doctrine of nullification. His service in Congress, and as Secretary of War under Monroe, gave him a practical training in affairs that was not without influence in qualifying his tendency to indulge in doctrinaire speculation. His service as Vice President afforded the leisure, and his break with Jackson the occasion, for his close study of the Constitution, to discover how the South might preserve slavery and yet continue in the Union. Finally, his position as a non-aristocratic leader of a body of aristocrats, and his Scotch-Irish birth and training, gave a peculiar strenuousness to his support of slavery, which is of course the cornerstone of his political philosophy, and determined his reliance upon logic rather than upon an appeal to the passions as the best means of inculcating his teaching and of establishing his policy. His political treatises, A Discourse on Government, and On the Constitution and Government of the United States, written just before his death in 1850, his pamphlets like the South Carolina Exposition and the Address to the People of South Carolina, and the great speeches delivered in the Senate from 1832 to the end of his term, especially those in which he defended against Webster the doctrine of nullification, could have emanated only from an up-country South Carolinian who had inherited the mantle of Jefferson, and had sat at the feet of John Taylor of Carolina and of John Randolph of Roanoke. Calhoun was, then, the logical outcome of his environment and his training. He was the fearless and honest representative of his people and section, and he was the master from whom rash disciples like Jefferson Davis broke away, when they found that logical analysis of the Constitution was a poor prop for slavery against the rising tide of civilization. As a thinker, Calhoun is remarkable for great powers of analysis and exposition. As a writer, he is chiefly noted for the even dignity and general serviceableness of his style. He writes well, but rather like a logician than like an inspired orator. He has not the stateliness of Webster, and is devoid of the power of arousing enthusiasm. The splendor of Burke's imagination is utterly beyond him, as is also the epigrammatic brilliance of John Randolph, from whom, however, he took not a few lessons in constitutional interpretation. Indeed, it must be confessed that for all his clearness and subtlety of intellect as a thinker, Calhoun is, as a writer, distinctly heavy. In this, as in many other respects, he reminds us of the Romans, to whom he was continually referring. Like them, he is conspicuous for strength of practical intellect. Like them, he is lacking in sublimity, charm, and nobility. It follows, then, that Calhoun will rarely be resorted to as a model of eloquence, but that he will continue to be read both on account of the substantial additions he made to political philosophy, and of the interesting exposition he gave of theories and ideas once potent in the nation's history. Notwithstanding the bitterness of accusation brought against him, he was not a traitor, nor a man given over to selfish ambition, as Dr. von Holst, his most competent biographer and critic, has clearly shown. Calhoun believed both in slavery and in the Union, and tried to maintain a balance between the two, because he thought that only in this way could his section maintain its prestige, or even its existence. He failed, as any other man would have done, and we find him, like Cassandra, a prophet whom we cannot love. But he did prophesy truly as to the fate of the South, and in the course of his strenuous labors to divert the ruin he saw impending, he gave to the world the most masterly analysis of the rights of the minority, and of the best methods of securing them that has yet come from the pen of a publicist. Remarks on the Right of Petition, delivered in the Senate, February 13th, 1840. Mr. Calhoun said he rose to express the pleasure he felt at the evidence which the remarks of the senator from Kentucky furnished of the progress of truth on the subject of abolition. He had spoken with strong approbation of the principle laid down in a recent pamphlet, that two races of different character and origin could not coexist in the same country without the subordination of the one to the other. He was gratified to hear the senator give assent to so important a principle in application to the condition of the South. He had himself, several years since, stated the same in more specific terms, that it was impossible for two races, so dissimilar in every respect as the European and African that inhabit the southern portion of this Union, to exist together in nearly equal numbers in any other relation than that which existed there. He also added that experience had shown that they could so exist in peace and happiness there, certainly to the great benefit of the inferior race, and that to destroy it was to doom the latter to destruction. But he uttered these important truths then in vain, as far as the side to which the senator belongs is concerned. He trusted the progress of truth would not, however, stop at the point to which it has arrived with the senator, and that it will make some progress in regard to what is called the right of petition. Never was a right so much mystified and magnified. To listen to the discussion, here and elsewhere, you would suppose it to be the most essential and important right. So far from it, he undertook to aver that under our free and popular system it was among the least of all our political rights. It had been superseded in a great degree by the far higher right of general suffrage, and by the practice, now so common, of instruction. There could be no local grievance but what could be reached by these, except it might be the grievance affecting a minority, which could be no more redressed by petition than by them. The truth is that the right of petition could scarcely be said to be the right of a freeman. It belongs to despotic governments more properly, and might be said to be the last right of slaves. Who ever heard of petition in the free states of antiquity? We had borrowed our notions in regard to it from our British ancestors, with whom it had a value for their imperfect representation, far greater than it has with us. And it is owing to that it has a place at all in our Constitution. The truth is that the right has been so far superseded in a political point of view that it has ceased to be what the Constitution contemplated it to be, a shield to protect against wrongs, and has been perverted into a sword to attack the rights of others, to cause a grievance instead of the means of redressing grievances, as in the case of abolition petitions. The senator from Ohio, Mr. Tappan, has viewed this subject in its proper light, and has taken a truly patriotic and constitutional stand in refusing to present these firebrands, for which I heartily thank him in the name of my state. Had the senator from Kentucky followed the example, he would have rendered inestimable service to the country. It is useless to attempt concealment. The presentation of these incendiary positions is itself an infraction of the Constitution. All acknowledge, the senator himself, that the property which they are presented to destroy is guaranteed by the Constitution. Now I ask, if we have the right under the Constitution to hold the property, which none question, have we not also the right to hold it under the same sacred instrument, in peace and quiet? Is it not a direct infraction, then, of the Constitution to present petitions here in the Common Council of the Union, and to us, the agents appointed to carry its provisions into effect, and to guard the rights it secures, the professed aim of which is to destroy the property guaranteed by the instrument? There can be but one answer to these questions on the part of those who present such petitions, that the right of such petition is higher and more sacred than the Constitution, and our oaths to preserve and to defend it. To such monstrous results does the doctrine lead. Sir, I understand this whole question. The great mass of both parties to the North are opposed to abolition. The Democrats almost exclusively, the Whigs less so. Very few are to be found in the ranks of the former, but many in those of the latter. The only importance that the abolitionists have is to be found in the fact that their weight may be felt in elections, and this is no small advantage. The one party is unwilling to lose their weight, but at the same time unwilling to be blended with them on the main question, and hence is made this false, absurd, unconstitutional, and dangerous collateral issue on the right of petition. Here is the whole secret. They are willing to play the political game at our hazard, and that of the Constitution and the Union, for the sake of victory at the elections. But to show still more clearly how little foundation there is in the character of our government for the extravagant importance attached to this right, I asked the senator, what is the true relation between the government and the people, according to our American conception? Which is principal and which agent? Which the master and which the servant? Which the sovereign and which the subject? There can be no answer. We are but the agents, the servants. We are not the sovereign. The sovereignty resides in the people of the states. How little applicable, then, is this boasted right of petition under our system to political questions? Who ever heard of the principal petitioning his agent, of the master his servant, or of the sovereign his subject? The very essence of a petition implies a request from an inferior to a superior. It is not, in fact, a natural growth of our system. It was copied from the British Bill of Rights, and grew up among a people whose representation was very imperfect, and where the sovereignty of the people was not recognized at all. And yet even there, this right so much insisted on here as being boundless as space was restricted from the beginning by the very men who adopted it in the British system, in the very manner which has been done in the other branch, this session, and to an extent far beyond. The two Houses of Parliament have again and again passed resolutions against receiving petitions, even to repeal taxes, and this those who formed our Constitution well knew, and yet adopted the provision almost identically contained in the British Bill of Rights, without guarding against the practice under it. Is not the conclusion irresistible that they did not deem it inconsistent with the right of the citizens peaceably to assemble and petition for a redress of grievance, as secured in the Constitution? The thing is clear. It is time that the truth should be known, and this cant about petition, not to redress the grievances of the petitioners, but to create a grievance elsewhere, be put down. I know this question to the bottom. I have viewed it under every possible aspect. There is no safety but in prompt, determined, and uncompromising defense of our rights to meet the danger on the frontier. There all rights are strongest, and more especially this. The moral is like the physical world. Nature has encrusted the exterior of all organic life for its safety. Let that be broken through, and it is all weakness within. So in the moral and political world. It is on the extreme limits of right that all wrong and encroachments are the most sensibly felt and easily resisted. I have acted on this principle throughout in this great contest. I took my lessons from the patriots of the Revolution. They met wrong promptly and defended right against the first encroachment. To sit here and hear ourselves and constituents and their rights and institutions essential to their safety assailed from day to day, denounced by every epithet calculated to degrade and render us odious, and to meet all this in silence, or still worse, to reason with the foul slanderers, would eventually destroy every feeling of pride and dignity, and sink us in feelings to the condition of the slaves they would emancipate. And this the senator advises us to do. Adopt it, and the two houses would be converted into halls to debate our rights to our property, and whether in holding it we were not thieves, robbers, and kidnappers, and we are to submit to this in order to quiet the North? I tell the senator that our union and our high moral tone of feeling on this subject at the South are infinitely more important to us than any possible effect that his course could have at the North, and that if we could have the weakness to adopt his advice, it would even fail to effect the object intended. It is proper to speak out. If this question is left to itself, unresisted by us, it cannot but terminate fatally to us. Our safety and honor are in the opposite direction, to take the highest ground and maintain it resolutely. The North will always take position below us, be ours high or low. It will yield all that we will and something more. If we go for rejection, they will at first insist on receiving, on the ground of respect for petition. If we yield that point and receive petitions, they will go for reference on the ground that it is absurd to receive and not to act, as it truly is. If we go for that, they will insist on reporting and discussing, and if that, the next step will be to make concession, to yield the point of abolition in this district, and so on till the whole process is consummated, each succeeding step proving more easy than its predecessor. The reason is obvious. The abolitionists understand their game. They throw their votes to the party most disposed to favor them. Now, sir, in the hot contest of party in the northern section, on which the ascendancy in their several states in the general government may depend, all the passions are roused to the greatest height in the violent struggle, and aid sought in every quarter. They would forget us in the heat of battle. Yes, the success of the election for the time would be more important than our safety, unless we, by our determined stand on our rights, cause our weight to be felt, and satisfy both parties that they have nothing to gain by courting those who aim at our destruction. As far as this government is concerned, that is our only remedy. If we yield that, if we lower our stand to permit partisans to woo the aid of those who are striking at our interests, we shall commence a descent in which there is no stopping place short of total abolition, and with it, our destruction. A word in answer to the senator from Massachusetts, Mr. Webster. He attempted to show that the right of petition was peculiar to free governments, so far as the assertion from being true that it is more appropriately the right of despotic governments, and the more so, the more absolute and austere. So far from being peculiar or congenial to free popular states, it degenerates under them, necessarily into an instrument, not of redress for the grievances of the petitioners, but, as has been remarked, of assault on the rights of others, as in this case. That I am right in making the assertion, I put it to the senator. Have we not a right, under the Constitution, to our property and our slaves? Would it not be a violation of the Constitution to divest us of that right? Have we not a right to enjoy, under the Constitution, peaceably and quietly our acknowledged rights guaranteed by it, without annoyance? The senator assents. He does but justice to his candor and intelligence. Now I ask him, how can he assent to receive petitions whose object is to annoy and disturb our right, and of course in direct infraction of the Constitution? The senator from Ohio, Mr. Tappan, in refusing to present these incendiary and unconstitutional petitions, has adopted a course truly constitutional and patriotic, in my opinion, the only one that is so. I deeply regret that it has not been followed by the senator from Kentucky in the present instance. Nothing short of it can put a stop to the mischief, and do justice to one half of the states of the Union. If adopted by others, we shall soon hear no more of abolition. The responsibility of keeping alive this agitation must rest on those who may refuse to follow so noble an example. End of section 44.
Section 45 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne Spiegel. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 7, by various authors. Section 45. Selected Speeches by John Caldwell Calhoun. John Caldwell Calhoun, 1872 to 1850, by W. P. Trent. John C. Calhoun's importance as a statesman has naturally stood in the way of his recognition as a writer, and in like manner his reputation as an orator has overshadowed his just claims to be considered our most original political thinker. The 6 volumes of his collected works, which unfortunately do not embrace his still inaccessible private correspondence, are certainly not exhilarating or attractive reading, but they are unique in the literature of America, if not of the world, as models of passionless logical analysis. Whether passionless logical analysis is ever an essential quality of true literature is a matter on which opinions will differ, but until the question is settled in the negative, Calhoun's claims to be considered a writer of marked force and originality cannot be ignored. It is true that circumstances have invalidated much of his political teaching, and that it was always negative and destructive rather than positive and constructive. It is also true that much of the interest attaching to his works is historical rather than literary in character. But when all allowances are made, it will be found that the Disquisition on Government must still be regarded as the most remarkable political treatise our country has produced, and that the position of its author as the head of a school of political thought is commanding and in a way unassailable. The precise character of Calhoun's political philosophy, the keynote of which was the necessity and means of defending the rights of minorities, cannot be understood without a brief glance at his political career. His birth in 1782, just after the Revolution, and in South Carolina, gave him the opportunity to share in the victory that the West and the far South won over the Virginians, headed by Madison. His training at Yale gave a nationalistic bias to his early career, and determined that search for the via media between consolidation and anarchy which resulted in the doctrine of nullification. His service in Congress and as Secretary of War under Monroe gave him a practical training in affairs that was not without influence in qualifying his tendency to indulge in doctrinaire speculation. His service as Vice President afforded the leisure, and his break with Jackson the occasion, for his close study of the Constitution, to discover how the South might preserve slavery and yet continue in the Union. Finally, his position as a non-aristocratic leader of a body of aristocrats, and his Scotch-Irish birth and training gave a peculiar strenuousness to his support of slavery, which is of course the cornerstone of his political philosophy, and determined his reliance upon logic rather than upon an appeal to the passions, as the best means of inculcating his teaching and of establishing his policy. His political treatises, A Discourse on Government and On the Constitution and Government of the United States, written just before his death in 1850. His pamphlets like the South Carolina Exposition and Address to the People of South Carolina, and the great speeches delivered in the Senate from 1832 to the end of his term, especially those in which he defended against Webster the doctrine of nullification, could have emanated only from an up-country South Carolinian who had inherited the mantle of Jefferson and had sat at the feet of John Taylor of Carolina and of John Randolph of Roanoke. Calhoun was, then, the logical outcome of his environment and training. He was the fearless and honest representative of his people and section, and he was the master from whom rash disciples like Jefferson Davis broke away when they found that logical analysis of the Constitution was a poor prop for slavery against the rising tide of civilization. As a thinker, Calhoun is remarkable for great powers of analysis and exposition. As a writer, he is chiefly noted for the even dignity and general serviceableness of his style. He writes well, but rather like a logician than like an inspired orator. He has not the stateliness of Webster, and is devoid of the power of arousing enthusiasm. The splendor of Burke's imagination is utterly beyond him, as is also the epigrammatic brilliance of John Randolph, from whom, however, he took not a few lessons in constitutional interpretation. Indeed, it must be confessed that for all his clearness and subtlety of intellect as a thinker, Calhoun is as a writer distinctly heavy. In this, as in many other respects, he reminds us of the Romans, to whom he was continually referring. Like them, he is conspicuous for strength of practical intellect. Like them, he is lacking in sublimity, charm, and nobility. It follows, then, that Calhoun will rarely be resorted to as a model of eloquence, but that he will continue to be read, both on account of the substantial additions he made to political philosophy, and of the interesting exposition he gave of theories and ideas once potent in the nation's history. Notwithstanding the bitterness of accusation brought against him, he was not a traitor, nor a man given over to selfish ambition, as Dr. von Holst, his most competent biographer and critic, has clearly shown. Calhoun believed both in slavery and in the Union, and tried to maintain a balance between the two, because he thought that only in this way could his section maintain its prestige or even its existence. He failed, as any other man would have done, and we find him, like Cassandra, a prophet whom we cannot love. But he did prophesy truly as to the fate of the South, and in the course of his strenuous labors to divert the ruin he saw impending, He gave to the world the most masterly analysis of the rights of the minority, and of the best methods of securing them, that has yet come from the pen of a publicist. Remarks on the right of petition, delivered to the Senate, February 13, 1840. Mr. Calhoun said he rose to express the pleasure he felt at the evidence which the remarks of the senator from Kentucky furnished, of the progress of truth on the subject of abolition. He had spoken with strong approbation of the principle laid down in a recent pamphlet, that two races of different character and origin could not coexist in the same country without the subordination of the one to the other. He was gratified to hear the senator give assent to so important a principle in application to the condition of the South. He had himself, several years since, stated the same in more specific terms, that it was impossible for two races, so dissimilar in every respect as the European and African that inhabit the southern portion of this Union, to exist together in nearly equal numbers in any other relation than that which existed there. He also added that experience had shown that they could so exist in peace and happiness there, certainly to the great benefit of the inferior race, and that to destroy it was to doom the latter to destruction. But he uttered these important truths then in vain, as far as the side to which the senator belongs is concerned. He trusted the progress of truth would not, however, stop at the point to which it has arrived with the senator, and that it will make some progress in regard to what is called the right of petition. Never was a right so much mystified and magnified. To listen to the discussion, here and elsewhere, you would suppose it to be the most essential and important right. So far from it. He undertook to aver that under our free and popular system it was among the least of all our political rights. It had been superseded in a great degree by the far higher right of general suffrage, and by the practice, now so common, of instruction. There could be no local grievance but what could be reached by these, except it might be the grievance affecting a minority, which could be no more redressed by petition than by them. The truth is, that the right of petition could scarcely be said to be a right of a freeman. It belongs to despotic governments more properly, and might be said to be the last right of slaves. Who ever heard of petition in the free states of antiquity? We had borrowed our notions in regard to it from our British ancestors, with whom it had a value for their imperfect representation far greater than it has with us. And it is owing to that it has a place at all in our Constitution. The truth is that the right has been so far superseded in a political point of view that it has ceased to be what the Constitution contemplated it to be, a shield to protect against wrongs, and has been perverted into a sword to attack the rights of others, to cause a grievance instead of the means of redressing grievances, as in the case of abolition petitions. The senator from Ohio, Mr. Tappan, has viewed this subject in its proper light, and has taken a truly patriotic and constitutional stand in refusing to present these firebrands, for which I heartily thank him in the name of my state. Had the senator from Kentucky followed his example, he would have rendered inestimable service to the country. It is useless to attempt concealment. The presentation of these incendiary petitions is itself an infraction of the Constitution. All acknowledge, the senator himself, that the property which they are presented to destroy is guaranteed by the Constitution. Now I ask, if we have the right under the Constitution to hold the property, which none question, have we not also the right to hold it under the same sacred instrument in peace and quiet? Is it not a direct infraction, then, of the Constitution to present petitions here in the Common Council of the Union, and to us, the agents appointed to carry its provisions into effect and to guard the rights it secures, the professed aim of which is to destroy the property guaranteed by the instrument? There can be but one answer to these questions on the part of those who present such petitions, that the right of such petition is higher and more sacred than the Constitution, and our oaths to preserve and defend it. To such monstrous results does the doctrine lead. Sir, I understand the whole question. The great mass of both parties to the North are opposed to abolition, the Democrats almost exclusively, the Whigs less so. Very few are to be found in the ranks of the former, but many in those of the latter. The only importance that the abolitionists have is to be found in the fact that their weight may be felt in elections, and this is no small advantage. The one party is unwilling to lose their weight, but at the same time unwilling to be blended with them on the main question, and hence is made this false, absurd, unconstitutional, and dangerous collateral issue on the right of petition. Here is the whole secret. They are willing to play the political game at our hazard, and that of the Constitution and the Union, for the sake of victory at the elections. But to show still more clearly how little foundation there is in the character of our government for the extravagant importance attached to this right, I ask the Senator what is the true relation between the government and the people, according to our American conception? Which is the principal and which the agent? Which the master and which the servant? Which the sovereign and which the subject? There can be no answer. We are but the agents, the servants. We are not the sovereign. The sovereignty rests in the people of the states. How little applicable, then, is this boasted right of petition, under our system, to political questions? Who ever heard of the principal petitioning his agent, of the master his servant, or of the sovereign his subject? The very essence of a petition implies a request from an inferior to a superior. It is not in fact a natural growth of our system. It was copied from the British Bill of Rights, and grew up among a people whose representation was very imperfect, and where the sovereignty of the people was not recognized at all. And yet even there, this right so much insisted on here as being boundless as space, was restricted from the beginning by the very men who adopted it in the British system, in the very manner which has been done in the other branch, this session, and to an extent far beyond. The two Houses of Parliament have again and again passed resolutions against receiving petitions, even to repeal taxes, and this those who formed our Constitution well knew, and yet adopted the provision almost identically contained in the British Bill of Rights, without guarding against the practice under it. Is not the conclusion irresistible, that they did not deem it inconsistent with the right of the citizens peaceably to assemble and petition for a redress of grievance, as secured in the Constitution? The thing is clear. It is time that the truth should be known, and this cant about petition, not to redress the grievances of the petitioners, but to create a grievance elsewhere, be put down. I know this question to the bottom. I have viewed it under every possible aspect. There is no safety but in prompt, determined, and uncompromising defense of our rights, to meet the danger on the frontier. There all rights are strongest, and more especially this. The moral is like the physical world. Nature has encrusted the exterior of all organic life for its safety. Let that be broken through, and it is all weakness within. So in the moral and political world. It is on the extreme limits of right that all wrong and encroachments are the most sensibly felt and easily resisted. I have acted on this principle throughout in this great contest. I took my lessons from the patriots of the Revolution. They met wrong promptly, and defended right against the first encroachment. To sit here and hear ourselves and constituents, and their rights and institutions, essentially to their safety, assailed from day to day, denounced by every epithet calculated to degrade and render us odious, and to meet all this in silence, or still worse, to reason with foul slanderers, would eventually destroy every feeling of pride and dignity, and sink us in feelings to the condition of the slaves they would emancipate. And this the Senator advises us to do. Adopt it, and the two houses would be converted into halls to debate our rights to our property, and whether in holding it we were not thieves, robbers, and kidnappers, and we are subject to this in order to quiet the North. I tell the Senator that our Union and our high moral tone of feeling on this subject at the South are infinitely more important to us than any possible effect that his course could have at the North, and that if we could have the weakness to adopt his advice, it would even fail to effect the object intended. It is proper to speak out. If this question is left to itself, unresisted by us, it cannot but terminate fatally to us. Our safety and honor are in the opposite direction, to take the highest ground and maintain it resolutely. The North will always take position below us, be ours high or low. They will yield all that we will, and sometimes more. If we go for rejection, they will at first insist on receiving, on the ground of respect to petition. If we yield that point and receive petitions, they will go for reference, on the ground that it be absurd to receive and not to act, as it truly is. If we go for that, they will insist on reporting and discussing, and if that, the next step will be to make concession, to yield the point of abolition to this district, and so on till the whole process is consummated, each succeeding step proving more easy than its predecessor. The reason is obvious. The abolitionists understand their game. They throw their votes to the party most disposed to favor them. Now, sir, in the hot contest of party in the northern section, on which the ascendancy in their several states and the general government may depend, all the passions are roused to the greatest height in the violent struggle, and aid sought in every quarter. They would forget us in the heat of battle. Yes, the success of the election, for the time, would be more important than our safety, unless we by our determined stand on our rights cause our weight to be felt, and satisfy both parties that they have nothing to gain by courting those who aim at our destruction. As far as this government is concerned, that is our only remedy. If we yield that, if we lower our stand to permit partisans to woo the aid of those who are striking at our interests, we shall commence a descent in which there is no stopping place short of total abolition, and with it our destruction. A word in answer to the senator from Massachusetts, Mr. Webster. He attempted to show that the right of petition was peculiar to free governments. So far is the assertion from being true that it is more appropriately the right of despotic governments, and the more so, the more absolute and austere. So far from being peculiar or congenial to free popular states, it degenerates under them, necessarily, into an instrument, not of redress for the grievances of the petitioners, but, as has been remarked, of assault on the rights of others, as in this case. That I am right in making the assertion, I put it to the senator. Have we not a right under the Constitution to our property in our slaves? Would it not be a violation of the Constitution to divest us of that right? Have we not a right to enjoy, under the Constitution, peaceably and quietly, our acknowledged rights guaranteed by it, without annoyance? The senator assents. He does but justice to his candor and intelligence. Now I ask him, how can he assent to receive petitions whose object is to annoy and disturb our right, and of course in direct infraction of the Constitution? The senator from Ohio, Mr. Tappan, in refusing to present these incendiary and unconstitutional petitions, has adopted a course truly constitutional and patriotic, and in my opinion the only one that is so. I deeply regret that it has not been followed by the senator from Kentucky in the present instance. Nothing short of it can put a stop to the mischief, and do justice to one half of the states of the Union. If adopted by others, we shall soon hear no more of abolition. The responsibility of keeping alive this agitation must rest on those who may refuse to follow so noble an example. States' Rights. From the Speech on Admission of Michigan, 1837. It has, perhaps, been too much of my habit to look more to the future and less to the present than is wise, but such is the constitution of my mind, that when I see before me the indications of causes calculated to effect important changes in our political condition, I am led irresistibly to trace them to their sources and follow them out to their consequences. Language has been held in this discussion, which is clearly revolutionary in its character and tendency, and which warns us of the approach of the period when the struggle will be between the conservatives and the destructives. I understood the senator from Pennsylvania, Mr. Buchanan, as holding language countenancing the principle that the will of a mere numerical majority is paramount to the authority of law and constitution. He did not indeed announce distinctly this principle, but it might fairly be inferred from what he said, for he told us the people of a state where the Constitution gives the same weight to a smaller as to a greater number might take the remedy into their own hands, meaning, as I understand him, that a mere majority might at their pleasure subvert the Constitution and government of a state, which he seems to think was the essence of a democracy. Our little state has a constitution that could not stand a day against such doctrines, and yet we glory in it as the best in the Union. It is a constitution which respects all the great interests of the state, giving to each a separate and distinct voice in the management of its political affairs, by means of which the feebler interests are protected against the preponderance of the stronger. We call our state a republic, a commonwealth, not a democracy, and let me tell the senator, It is a far more popular government than if it had been based on the simple principle of the numerical majority. It takes more voices to put the machine of government in motion than in those that the senator would consider more popular. It represents all the interests of the state, and is in fact the government of the people in the true sense of the term, and not that of the mere majority or the dominant interests. I am not familiar with the Constitution of Maryland, to which the senator alluded, and cannot therefore speak of its structure with confidence, but I believe it to be somewhat similar in its character to our own. That it is a government not without its excellence, we need no better proof than the fact that, though within the shadow of executive influence, it has nobly and successfully resisted all the seductions by which a corrupt and artful administration, with almost boundless patronage, has attempted to seduce her into its ranks. Looking then to the approaching struggle, I take my stand immovably. I am a conservative in its broadest and fullest sense, and as such I shall ever remain, unless indeed the government shall become so corrupt and disordered that nothing short of revolution can reform it. I solemnly believe that our political system is, in its purity, not only the best that ever was formed, but the best possible that can be devised for us. It is the only one by which free states, so populous and wealthy, and occupying so vast an extent of territory, can preserve their liberty. Thus thinking, I cannot hope for a better. Having no hope of a better, I am a conservative, and because I am a conservative, I am a state rights man. I believe that in the rights of the states are to be found the only effectual means of checking the overaction of this government. To resist its tendency to consecrate all power here, and to prevent a departure from the Constitution, or in case of one, to restore the government to its original simplicity and purity. State interposition, or to express it more fully, the right of a state to interpose her sovereign voice, as one of the parties to our constitutional compact, against the encroachments of this government, is the only means of sufficient potency to effect all this, and I am therefore its advocate. I rejoice to hear the senators from North Carolina, Mr. Brown, and from Pennsylvania, Mr. Buchanan, do us justice to distinguish between nullification and the anarchical and revolutionary movements in Maryland and Pennsylvania. I know they did not intend it as a compliment, but I regard it as the highest. They are right. Day and night are not more different, more unlike in everything. They are unlike in their principles, their objects, and their consequences. I shall not stop to make good this assertion, as I might easily do. The occasion does not call for it. As a conservative and a state rights man, or if you will have it, a nullifier, I have resisted and shall resist all encroachments on the Constitution, whether of this government on the rights of the states, or the opposite, whether of the executive on Congress, or Congress on the executive. My creed is to hold both governments, and all the departments of each, to their proper sphere, and to maintain the authority of the laws and the Constitution against all revolutionary movements. I believe the means which our system furnishes to preserve itself are ample, if fairly understood and applied, and I shall resort to them, however corrupt and disordered the times, so long as there is hope of reforming the government. The result is in the hands of the disposer of events. It is my part to do my duty. Yet while I thus openly avow myself a conservative, God forbid I should ever deny the glorious right of rebellion and revolution. Should corruption and opposition become intolerable, and not otherwise be thrown off, if liberty must perish or the government be overthrown, I would not hesitate, at the hazard of life, to resort to revolution, and to tear down a corrupt government that could neither be reformed nor borne by freemen. But I trust in God things will never come to that pass. I trust never to see such fearful times, for fearful indeed they would be if they should ever befall us. It is the last remedy, and not to be thought of till common sense and the voice of mankind would justify the resort. Before I resume my seat, I feel called on to make a few brief remarks on a doctrine of fearful import which has been broached in the course of this debate. The right to repeal laws granting bank charters, and of course railroads, turnpikes, and joint stock companies. It is a doctrine of fearful import, and calculated to do infinite mischief. There are countless millions vested in such stocks, and it is a description of property of the most delicate character. To touch it is almost to destroy it. But while I enter my protest against all such doctrines, I have been greatly alarmed with the thoughtless precipitancy, not to use a stronger phrase, with which the most extensive and dangerous privileges have been granted of late. It can end in no good, and I fear may be the cause of convulsions hereafter. We already feel the effects on the currency, which no one competent of judging can fail to see is in an unsound condition. I must say, for truth compels me, I have ever distrusted the banking system, at least in its present form, both in this country and Great Britain. It will not stand the test of time, but I trust that all shocks or sudden revolutions may be avoided, and that it may gradually give way before some sounder and better regulated system of credit, which the growing intelligence of the age may advise. That a better may be substituted I cannot doubt, but of what it shall consist, and how it shall finally supersede the present uncertain and fluctuating currency, time alone can determine. All that I can see is, that the present must, one day or another, come to an end or be greatly modified, if that indeed can save it from an entire overthrow. It has within itself the seeds of its own destruction. On the Government of Poland, from a Disquisition on Government. It is then a great error to suppose that the government of the concurrent majority is impracticable, or that it rests on a feeble foundation. History furnishes many examples of such governments, and among them one in which the principle was carried to an extreme that would be thought impracticable had it never existed. I refer to that of Poland. In this it was carried to such an extreme that in the election of her kings the concurrence or acquiescence of every individual of the nobles and gentry present, in an assembly numbering usually from 150 to 200,000, was required to make a choice, thus giving to each individual a veto in his election. So likewise every member of her Diet, the supreme legislative body, consisting of the king, the senate, bishops, and deputies of the nobility and gentry of the palatinates, possessed a veto on all its proceedings, thus making a unanimous vote necessary to enact a law or to adopt any measure whatever. And as if to carry the principle to the utmost extent, the veto of a single member not only defeated the particular bill or measure in question, but prevented all others passed during the session from taking effect. Further, the principle could not be carried. It in fact made every individual of the nobility and gentry a distinct element in the organism, or to vary the expression, made him an estate of the kingdom. And yet this government lasted in this form more than 2 centuries, embracing the period of Poland's greatest power and renown. Twice during its existence she protected Christendom, when in great danger, by defeating the Turks under the walls of Vienna, and permanently arresting thereby the tide of their conquest westward. It is true her government was finally subverted, and the people subjugated, in consequence of the extreme to which the principle was carried, not however because of its tendency to dissolution from weakness, but from the facility it afforded to powerful and unscrupulous neighbors to control by their intrigues the election of her kings. But the fact that a government in which the principle was carried to the utmost extreme not only existed, but existed for so long a period in great power and splendor, is proof conclusive both of its practicability and its compatibility with the power and permanency of government. Urging the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, from a speech to the Senate, March 4, 1850. Having now shown what cannot save the Union, I return to the question with which I commenced. How can the Union be saved? There is but one way by which it can with any certainty, and that is by a full and final settlement, on the principle of justice, of all the questions at issue between the 2 sections. The South asks for justice, simple justice, and less she ought not to take. She has no compromise to offer but the Constitution, and no concession or surrender to make. She has already surrendered so much that she has little left to surrender. Such a settlement would go to the root of the evil and remove all cause of discontent. By satisfying the South, she could remain honorably and safely in the Union, and thereby restore the harmony and fraternal feelings between the sections which existed anterior to the Missouri agitation. Nothing else can with any certainty finally and forever settle the question at issue, terminate agitation, and save the Union. But can this be done? Yes, easily. Not by the weaker party, for it can of itself do nothing, not even protect itself, but by the stronger. The North has only to will it to accomplish it, to do justice by conceding to the South an equal right in the acquired territory, and to do her duty by causing the stipulations relative to fugitive slaves to be faithfully fulfilled, to cease the agitation of the slave question, and to provide for the insertion of a provision in the Constitution by an amendment which will restore to the South in substance the power she possessed of protecting herself before the equilibrium between the sections was destroyed by the action of this government. There will be no difficulty in devising such a provision, one that will protect the South, and which at the same time will improve and strengthen the government instead of impairing and weakening it. But will the North agree to this? It is for her to answer the question. But I will say she cannot refuse if she has half the love of the Union which she professes to have, or without justly exposing herself to the charge that her love of power and aggrandizement is far greater than her love of the Union. At all events, the responsibility of saving the Union rests on the North and not on the South. The South cannot save it by any act of hers, and the North may save it without any sacrifice whatever, unless to do justice, and to perform her duties under the Constitution, should be regarded by her as a sacrifice. It is time, Senators, that there should be an open and manly avowal on all sides as to what is intended to be done. If the question is not now settled, it is uncertain whether it ever can hereafter be, and we, as the representatives of the States of this Union, regarded as governments, should come to a distinct understanding as to our respective views, in order to ascertain whether the great question at issue can be settled or not. If you who represent the stronger portion cannot agree to settle them on the broad principle of justice and duty, say so, and let the States we both represent agree to separate and part in peace. If you are unwilling we should part in peace, tell us so, and we shall know what to do when you reduce the question to submission or resistance. If you remain silent, you will compel us to infer by your acts what you intend. In that case, California will become the test question. If you admit her, under all the difficulties that oppose her admission, you compel us to infer that you intend to exclude us from the whole of the acquired territories, with the intention of destroying irretrievably the equilibrium between the two sections. We would be blind not to perceive in that case that your real objects are power and aggrandizement, and infatuated not to act accordingly. I have now, Senators, done my duty in expressing my opinions fully, freely, and candidly on this solemn occasion. In doing so I have been governed by the motives which have governed me in all stages of the agitation of the slavery question since its commencement. I have exerted myself during the whole period to arrest it, with the intention of saving the Union if it could be done, and if it could not, to save the section where it has pleased Providence to cast my lot, and which I sincerely believe has justice and the Constitution on its side. Having faithfully done my duty to the best of my ability, both to the Union and my section, throughout this agitation, I shall have the consolation, let what will come, that I am free from all responsibility. End of section 45.
Section 46 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 7, by various authors. Section 46. Selected excerpts by Callimachus. Callimachus, 3rd century B.C. Callimachus, the most learned of poets, was the son of Battus and Mesatme of Cyrene, and a disciple of Hermocrates, who, like his more celebrated pupil, was a grammarian, or a follower of belles lettres. Says Suidas, "It is in this calling that we first hear of Callimachus, when he was a teacher at Alexandria. Here he counted among his pupils Apollonius Rhodius, author of the Argonautica, and Eratosthenes, famous for his wisdom in science, who knew geography and geometry so well that he measured the circumference of the earth. Callimachus was in fact one of those erudite poets and wise men of letters whom the gay Alexandrians, who thronged the court of Ptolemy Philadelphus, called the Pleiades, Apollonius, Rhodius, Aratus, Theocritus, Lycophron, Nicander, and Homer, son of Macro, were the other 6. From his circle of clever people, the king, with whom he had become a prime favourite, called him to be chief custodian over the stores of precious books at Alexandria. These libraries, we may recall, were the ones Julius Cæsar partially burned by accident a century later, and Bishop Theophilus and his mob of Christian zealots finished destroying as repositories of paganism some 3 centuries later still. The collection said to have been destroyed by Caliph Omar when Amru took Alexandria in 640 A.D., on the ground that if they agreed with the Koran they were superfluous, and if they contradicted it they were blasphemous, were later ones, but the whole story is discredited by modern scholarship. The world has not ceased mourning for this untold and irreparable loss of the choicest fruits of the human spirit. Of all these precious manuscripts and parchments, then, Callimachus was made curator about the year B.C. 260. Aulus Gellius computes the time in this wise: 490 years after the founding of Rome, the first Punic War was begun, and not long after Callimachus, the poet of Cyrene in Alexandria, flourished at the court of King Ptolemy. At this time he must have been already married to the wife of whom Suidas speaks of in his Lexicon, a daughter of a Syracusan gentleman. The number of Callimachus's works, which are reported to have reached 800, testifies to his popularity in the Alexandrian period of Greek literature. It contradicts also the maxim ascribed to him that a great book is a great evil. Among the prose works which would have enriched our knowledge of literature and history was his History of Greek Literature in 120 books, classifying the Greek writers and naming them chronologically. These were the results of his long labours in the libraries. Among them was a book on the Museum and the schools connected with it, with records of illustrious educators and of the books they had written. It is his poetry that has in the main survived, and yet, as Ovid says, calling him Badiades, either from his father's name or from the illustrious founder of his native Cyrene, Badiades semper toto cantabitur orbe, quamvis ingenio non vellet, arte vellet. Even throughout all lands Badiades' name will be famous. Though not in genius supreme, yet by his art he excels. Quintilian, however, says he was the prince of Greek elegiac poets. Of his elegies we have a few fragments, and also the Latin translation by Catullus of the Lock of Berenice. Berenice, the sister and wife of Ptolemy Euergetes, who succeeded his father Philadelphus in B.C. 245, had sacrificed some of her hair, laying it on the altar of a temple from which it was subsequently stolen. In his poem, Callimachus, as the court poet, sang how the gods had taken the tresses and placed them among the stars. The delicate and humorous Rape of the Lock of Alexander Pope is a rather remote repetition of the same fancy. We have also from Callimachus's hand 6 hymns to the gods and many epigrams, the latter of which, as will be seen by the quotations given below, are models of their kind. His lyric hymns are, in reality, rather epics in little. They are full of recondite information, overloaded indeed with learning, elegant, nervous, and elaborate, rather than easy flowing, simple, and warm, like a genuine product of the muse. Many of his epigrams grace the Greek anthology. Among the best editions of Callimachus is that of Ernesti, 1761. The extant poems and fragments have been in part translated by William Dodd, 1755, and H.W. Tytler, 1856. His scattered epigrams have incited many to attempt their perfect phrasing. Hymn to Jupiter. At Jove's high festival, what song of praise Shall we his suppliant adorers sing? To whom may we our paeans rather raise than to himself the great eternal King, who by his nod subdues each earth-born thing, whose mighty laws the gods themselves obey? But whether Crete first saw the father spring, or on Lycaeus' mount he burst on day, my soul is much in doubt, for both that praise essay. Some say that thou, O Jove, first saw the morn on Cretan Ida's sacred mountain side; others that thou in Arcady wert born, declare, Almighty Father, which have lied. Cretans were liars ever; in their pride have they built up a sepulchre for thee, as if the King of gods and men had died, and borne the lot of frail mortality. No, thou hast ever been, and art, and aye shalt be. Thy mother bore thee on Arcadian ground, old goddess Rhea, on a mountain's height, with bristling bramble thickets all around. The hallowed spot was curiously dight, and now no creature under heaven's light, from lovely woman down to things that creep, in need of Ilithia's holy rite, may dare approach that consecrated steep, whose name of Rhea's birthbed still Arcadians keep. Fair was the promise of thy childhood's prime, Almighty Jove, and fairly wert thou reared. Swift was thy march to manhood, ere thy time thy chin was covered by the manly beard. Though young in age, yet wert thou so revered for deeds of prowess prematurely done, that of thy peers or elders none appeared to claim his birthright. Heaven was all thine own, nor dared fell envy point her arrows at thy throne. Poets of old do sometimes lack of truth, for Saturn's ancient kingdom, as they tell, into 3 parts was split, as if forsooth there were a doubtful choice 'twixt heaven and hell. To one not fairly mad we know right well that lots are cast for more equality, but these against proportion do rebel, that naught can equal her discrepancy. If one must lie at all, a lie like truth for me. No chance gave thee the sovereignty of heaven, but to the deeds thy good right hand had done, and thine own strength and courage was it given. These placed thee first, still keep thee on thy throne. Thou tookest the goodly eagle for thine own, through whom to men thy wonders are declared. To me and mine propitious be they shown. Through thee by youth's best flower is heaven shared. Seamen and warriors heedest thou not, nor e'en the bard. These be the lesser gods' divided care, but kings, great Jove, are thine especial dower. They rule the land and sea, they guide the war. What is too mighty for a monarch's power? By Vulcan's aid the stalwart armourers shower their sturdy blows. Warriors to Mars belong, and gentle Dian ever loves to pour new blessings on her favoured hunter throng, while Phoebus aye directs the true-born poet's song. But monarchs spring from Jove, nor is there aught so near approaching Jove's celestial height, as deeds by heaven elected monarchs wrought. Therefore, O Father, kings are thine of right, and thou hast set them on a noble height, above their subject cities, and thine eye is ever on them, whether they delight to rule their people in iniquity, or by sound government to raise their name on high. Thou hast bestowed on all kings wealth and power, but not in equal measure, this we know, from knowledge of our own great Governor, who stands supreme of kings on earth below. His morning thoughts his nights and actions show, his less achievements when designed are done, while others squander years in counsels slow. Not rarely when the mighty seats are sown, are all their air-built hopes by thee, great Jove, o'erthrown. All hail, Almighty Jove, who gives to men all good and wardest off each evil thing. Oh, who can hymn thy praise? He hath not been, nor shall he be, that poet who may sing in fitting strain thy praises. Father, King, all hail, thrice hail, we pray to thee, dispense virtue and wealth to us, wealth varying, for virtues not, mere virtues no defence. Then send us virtue hand in hand with competence. Translation of Fitzjames T. Price. Epitaph. His little son of 12 years old, Philippus, here has laid Nicoteles, on whom so much his father's hopes were stayed. Epigram. Admired and paraphrased by Horace. The hunter in the mountains every roe and every hare pursues through frost and snow, tracking their footsteps. But if some one say, "See, here's a beast struck down," he turns away. Such is my love. I chase the flying game, and pass with coldness the self-offering dame. Epitaph on Heraclitus. They told me, Heraclitus, they told me you were dead. They brought me bitter news to hear, and bitter tears I shed. I wept as I remembered how often you and I had tired the sun with talking, and sent him down the sky. And now that thou art lying, my dear old caring guest, a handful of grey ashes, long, long ago at rest. Still are thy pleasant voices, thy nightingales awake. For death he taketh all away, but them he cannot take. Translation of William Johnson. Epitaph. Would that swift ships had never been, for so we ne'er had wept for Sophilus. But he, dead on the waves now drifts, whilst we must go past a void tomb, a mere name's mockery. Translation of J. A. Symonds. The Misanthrope. Say, honest Timon, now escaped from light, which do you most abhor, or that or night? Man, I most hate the gloomy shades below, and that because in them are more of you. Epitaph upon himself. Callimachus takes up this part of earth, a man much famed for poesy and mirth. Translation of William Dodd. Epitaph upon Cleombrotus. Loud cried Cleombrotus, "Farewell, O sun!" Ere, leaping from a well, he joined the dead. No act death meriting had the Ambraciote done, but Plato's volume on the soul had read. End of section 46.
Section 47 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 7. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 7, by various authors. Section 47, Selected Excerpts, by Charles Stewart Calverley. Charles Stewart Calverley, 1831 to 1884. No one ever attained greater fame with few slight and unserious books than this English author. His name rests upon 4 volumes only: Verses and Translations, 1862, Translations into English and Latin, 1866, Theocritus translated into English verse, 1869, and Fly Leaves, 1872. Fly Leaves holds a unique place in English literature. It is made up chiefly of parodies, which combine the mocking spirit with clever imitations of the style and affectations of familiar poets. They are witty, they are humorous, they are good-natured, and they are artistic and extraordinarily clever. His satirical banter shown in these verses, most of which are real poems as well as parodies, has been classed as refined common sense and the exuberant playfulness of a powerful mind and a tender and manly nature. It contains also independent literary skits and comiques, which are quite equal in merit to the parodies. Calverley was born at Martley, Worcestershire, December 22nd, 1831, the son of the Reverend Henry Blades, a descendant of an old Yorkshire family named Calverley. In 1852 Mr. Blades resumed the name of Calverley, which had been dropped at the beginning of the century. Calverley was more famous at Harrow for his marvelous jumping and other athletic feats than for his studies, but even at this period he showed great talent for translating from the classics, and astonished everyone by his gifts of memory. A few Latin verses won for him the Balliol Scholarship in 1850, and in the next year he received at Oxford the Chancellor's Prize for a Latin poem. In 1852 he went to Cambridge, and shortly after won the Craven Scholarship, as well as numerous medals and prizes for his attainments in Greek and Latin. This was the more remarkable inasmuch as he was extremely indolent and very fond of society, preferring to entertain his friends by his witty songs, his charming voice, his clever caricatures, for he had talent with his pencil, and his brilliant conversation, rather than to apply himself to routine work. His comrades used to lock him into a room to make him work, and even then he would outwit them by dashing off a witty parody or a bit of impromptu verse. Among his literary jeux d'esprit was an examination paper on Pickwick, prepared as a Christmas joke in exact imitation of a genuine exam. The prizes, 2 first editions of Pickwick, were won by W. Skeat, now famous as a philologist, and Walter Besant, known to the public as a novelist. Calverley remained in Cambridge as tutor and lecturer, and was presently called to the bar. It seemed the irony of fate that the famous athlete should receive an injury while skating, which compelled him to abandon his profession, and for 17 years practically abandon work. He died at Folkestone on February 17, 1884. That he was adored by his friends, and possessed unusual qualities of character as well as mind, may be seen in the memoir published by Walter T. Sendall, with The Literary Remains, 1885. Apart from his wit, Calverley has a distinct claim to remembrance on account of his remarkable scholarship. His translations from Greek and Latin have won the enthusiastic admiration of specialists and students of the classics. Dr. Gunson, tutor of his college, an accomplished Latinist, declared that he thought Calverley's Horatian verse better than Horace's, being equally poetical and more distinguished in style. These works not only attest his mastery of ancient languages, but also his acquaintance with the beauty and capacity of English verse, into which he has put a grace of his own. His numerous renderings of Latin into English and English into Latin show his ease and dexterity of both thought and touch, and his translation of Theocritus is considered by authorities to be a masterpiece of literary workmanship. From an examination paper, the posthumous papers of the Pickwick Club, from James Payn's Some Literary Recollections and Temple Bar, 1887. 1. Mention any occasion on which it is specified that the fat boy was not asleep, and that 1. Mr. Pickwick, and 2. Mr. Weller, Sr., ran. Deduce from expressions used on one occasion Mr. Pickwick's maximum of speed. 3. Who were Mr. Staple, Goodwin, Mr. Brooks, Willem, Mrs. Bunkin, Old Nobbs, Cast Iron Head, young Bantam? 4. What operation was performed on Tom Smart's chair? Who little thinks that in which pocket of what garment, in where, he has left what, entreating him to return to whom, with how many what, and all how big? 6. Mr. Weller's knowledge of London was extensive and peculiar. Illustrate this by a reference to facts. 8. Give in full Samuel Weller's first compliment to Mary, and his father's critique upon the same young lady. What church was on the Valentine that first attracted Mr. Samuel's eye in the shop? 9. Describe the common profile machine. 10. State the component parts of dog's nose and simplify the expression taking a grinder. 11. On finding his principal in the pound, Mr. Weller and the town beadle varied directly. Show that the latter was ultimately eliminated, and state the number of rounds in the square which is not described. 12. Anythink for air and exercise, as the wery old donkey observed when they woke him up from his death-bed to carry 10 gentlemen to Greenwich in a tax cart. Illustrate this by stating any remark recorded in the Pickwick Papers to have been made by a previously dumb animal, with the circumstances under which he made it. 18. How did the old lady make a memorandum, and of what, at whist? Show that there were at least 3 times as many fiddles as harps in Muggleton at the time of the ball at Manor Farm. 20. Write down the chorus to each line of Mr. S. Weller's song, and a sketch of the mottle-faced man's excursus on it. Is there any ground for conjecturing that he, Sam, had more brothers than one? 21. How many lumps of sugar went into the shepherd's liquor as a rule, and is any exception recorded? 23. She's a swelling visibly. When did the same phenomenon occur again, and what fluid caused the pressure on the body in the latter case? 24. How did Mr. Weller senior define the funds, and what view did he take of reduced consols? In what terms is his elastic force described when he assaulted Mr. Stiggins at the meeting? Write down the name of the meeting. 25. Probotognomon, a good judge of cattle, hence a good judge of character. Note on Aeschylus Agamemnon. Illustrate the theory involved by a remark of the parent Weller. 28. Deduce from a remark of Mr. Weller, Jr., the price per mile of cabs at the period. 29. What do you know of the hotel next the ball at Rochester? 30. Who, beside Mr. Pickwick, is recorded to have worn gaiters? Ballad, imitation of Jean Ingelow. The auld wife sat at her ivy door, butter and eggs and a pound of cheese, a thing she had frequently done before, and her spectacles lay on her aproned knees. The piper he piped on the hilltop pie, butter and eggs and a pound of cheese, till the cow said, "I die," and the goose asked, "Why?" and the dog said nothing, but searched for fleas. The farmer he strode through the square farmyard, butter and eggs and a pound of cheese. His last brew of ale was a trifle hard, the connection of which with the plot one sees. The farmer's daughter hath frank blue eyes, butter and eggs and a pound of cheese. She hears the rooks caw in the windy skies, as she sits at her lattice and shells her peas. The farmer's daughter hath ripe red lips, butter and eggs and a pound of cheese. If you try to approach her, away she skips over tables and chairs with apparent ease. The farmer's daughter hath soft brown hair, butter and eggs and a pound of cheese. And I've met with a ballad, I can't say where, which wholly consisted of lines like these. She sat with her hands 'neath her dimpled cheeks, butter and eggs and a pound of cheese, and spake not a word. While a lady speaks, there is hope, but she didn't even sneeze. She sat with her hands 'neath her crimson cheeks, butter and eggs and a pound of cheese. She gave up mending her father's breeks, and let the cat roll on her best chemise. She sat with her hands 'neath her burning cheeks, butter and eggs and a pound of cheese, and gazed at the piper for 13 weeks. Then she followed him out o'er the misty leas. Her sheep followed her, as their tails did them, butter and eggs and a pound of cheese. And this song is considered a perfect gem. And as to the meaning, it's what you please. Lovers and a Reflection. Imitation of Jean Ingelow. In moss-spranked dells, which the sunbeams flatter, and heaven it knoweth what that may mean, meaning, however, is no great matter, when woods are a-tremble with rifts atween, through God's own heather we wand together, I and my Willie, oh love, my love. I need hardly remark it was glorious weather, and flitterbats wavered alow above. Boats were curtsying, rising, bowing. Boats in that climate are so polite. And sands were a ribbon of green endowing, and oh, the sun-dazzle on bark and bight. Through the rare red heather we danced together, oh love, my Willie, and smelt for flowers. I must mention again it was gorgeous weather. Rhymes are so scarce in this world of ours. By rises that flushed with their purple favours, through becks that brattled o'er grasses sheen, we walked or waded, we two young shavers, thanking our stars we were both so green. We journeyed in parallels, I and Willie in fortunate parallels, butterflies hid in weltering shadows of daffodilly or marjoram, kept making peacock eyes. Song-birds darted about, some inky as coal, some snowy, I ween, as curds, or rosy as pinks, or as roses, pinky. They reek of no eerie to come, those birds. But they skim over bents which the mill stream washes, or hang in the lift 'neath a white cloud's hem. They need no parasols, no goloshes, and good Mrs. Trimmer, she feedeth them. Then we thrid God's cowslips, as erst his heather, that endowed the wan grass with their golden blooms, and snapped, it was perfectly charming weather, our fingers at fate, and her goddess glooms. And Willie gan sing, oh, his notes were fluty, wafts fluttered them out to the white-winged sea. Something made up of rhymes that have done much duty, rhymes, better to put it, of ancientry. Bowers of flowers encountered showers in William's carol, oh, love my Willie, when he bade sorrow borrow from blithe tomorrow. I quite forget what, say a daffodilly. A nest in a hollow, with buds to follow, I think occurred next in his nimble strain, and clay that was needin, of course in Eden, a rhyme most novel, I do maintain. Mist's bones, the singer himself, love stories, and all at least furlable things got furled, not with any design to conceal their glories, but simply and solely to rhyme with world. Oh, if billows and pillows and hours and flowers and all the brave rhymes of an elder day could be furled together this genial weather, and carted or carried in wafts away, nor ever again trotted out, ay me, how much fewer volumes of verse there'd be. Visions from Flyleaves. She was a phantom, etc. In lone Glenartney's thickets lies couched the lordly stag. The dreaming terrier's tail forgets its customary wag. The plodding ploughman's weary steps insensibly grow quicker, as broadening casements light them on toward home, or home-brewed liquor. It is, in brief, the evening, that pure and pleasant time, when stars break into splendor, and poets into rhyme. When in the glass of memory the forms of loved ones shine, and when, of course, Miss Goodchild is prominent in mine. Miss Goodchild, Julia Goodchild, how graciously you smiled upon my childish passion once, yourself a fair-haired child, when I was, no doubt, profiting by Dr. Crabbe's instruction, and sent those streaky lollipops home for your fairy suction. She wore her natural roses the night when first we met. Her golden hair was gleaming 'neath the coercive net. Her brow was like the snawdrift, her step was like Queen Mab's, and gone was instantly the heart of every boy at Crabbe's. The parlor boarder chassed towards her on graceful limb, the onyx decked his bosom, but her smiles were not for him. With me she danced, till drowsily her eyes began to blink, and I brought raisin wine and said, "Drink, pretty creature, drink." And evermore, when winter comes in his garb of snows, and the returning schoolboy is told how fast he grows, shall I, with that soft hand in mine, enact ideal lancers, and dream I hear demure remarks, and make impassioned answers. I know that never, never may her love for me return. At night I muse upon the fact with undisguised concern. But ever shall I bless that day. I don't bless, as a rule, the days I spent at Dr. Crabbe's preparatory school. And yet we two may meet again. Be still, my throbbing heart! Now rolling years have weaned us from jam and raspberry tart. One night I saw a vision. 'Twas when musk roses bloom. We stood, upon a rug in a sumptuous dining room. One hand clasped hers, one easily reposed upon my hip, and "Bless ye" burst abruptly from Mr. Goodchild's lip. I raised my brimming eye, and saw in hers an answering gleam. My heart beat wildly, and I woke, and lo, it was a dream. Changed. I know not why my soul is racked, why I ne'er smile as was my wont. I only know that, as a fact, I don't. I used to roam o'er glen and glade, buoyant and blithe as other folk, and not unfrequently I made a joke. A minstrel's fire within me burned. I'd sing as one whose heart must break, lay upon lay. I nearly learned to shake. All day I sang of love and fame, of fights our fathers fought of yore, until the thing almost became a bore. I cannot sing the old songs now. It is not that I deem them low, 'tis that I can't remember how they go. I could not range the hills till high above me stood the summer moon, and as to dancing, I could fly as soon. The sports to which with boyish glee I sprang erewhile attract no more, although I am but 63 or 4. Nay, worse than that, I've seemed of late to shrink from happy boyhood. Boys have grown so noisy, and I hate a noise. They fright me when the beech is green by swarming up its stem for eggs. They drive their horrid hoops between my legs. It's idle to repine, I know. I'll tell you what I'll do instead. I'll drink my arrowroot and go to bed. Thoughts at a Railway Station. 'Tis but a box of modest deal, directed to no matter where. Yet down my cheek the teardrops steal. Yes, I am blubbering like a seal, for on it is this mute appeal, with care. I am a stern, cold man, and range apart, but those vague words, with care, wake yearnings in me sweet as strange. Drawn from my moral moated grange, I feel I rather like the change of air. Hast thou ne'er seen rough pointsmen spy some simple English phrase, with care, or this side uppermost, and cry like children? No, no more have I. Yet deem not him whose eyes are dry a bear. But ah, what treasure hides beneath that lid so much the worse for wear? A ring, perhaps, a rosy wreath, a photograph by Vernon Heath, some matron's temporary teeth or hair. Perhaps some seaman in Peru or Ind hath stowed herein a rare cargo of birds' eggs for his Sue, with many a vow that he'll be true, and many a hint that she is too fair. Perhaps, but wherefore vainly pry into the page that's folded there? I shall be better by and by. The porters, as I sit and sigh, pass and repass. I wonder why they stare. Forever. Forever, 'tis a single word. Our rude forefathers deemed it two. Can you imagine so absurd a view? Forever, what abysms of woe the word reveals, what frenzy, what despair, for ever printed so, did not. It looks, ah me, how trite and tame! It fails to sadden or appall or solace. It is not the same at all. O thou to whom it first occurred to solder the disjoined and dower thy native language with the word of power! We bless thee, whether far or near thy dwelling, whether dark or fair thy kingly brow, is neither here nor there. But in men's hearts shall be thy throne, while the great pulse of England beats, thou coiner of a word unknown to Keats. And never more must printer do as men did long ago, but run 4 into ever, bidding 2 be 1. For ever, passion fraught, it throws o'er the dim page a gloom, a glamour, it's sweet, it's strange, and I suppose it's grammar. Forever, 'tis a single word, and yet our fathers deemed it 2. Nor am I confident they erred. Are you? Full contents of Smith letter. Respected and honoured Madam, having long and vainly sought an opportunity to convey to you the expression of my sentiments, I now avail myself of the privilege of epistolary communication to acquaint you with the fact that the emotions which you have raised in my breast are those which should point to connubial love and affection, rather than to simple friendship. In short, madam, I have the honour to approach you with a proposal, the acceptance of which will fill me with ecstatic gratitude, and enable me to extend to you those protecting cares which the matrimonial bond makes at once the duty and the privilege of him who would, at no distant date, lead to the hymeneal altar one whose charms and virtues should suffice to kindle its flames without extraneous aid. I remain, dear madam, your humble servant and ardent adorer, J. Smith. End of section 47, recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio. End of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 7.